get started, I just wanted to do a few housekeeping notes now that I'm out of breath. I can run marathons, but not stairs. So we're having the happy hour today at 4 o'clock, and I really hope, even if you haven't RSVP'd, that you will come. Food and beverages, compliments of spectrum management, and the fees that normally instructors will receive for teaching this class, Dale and Brian generously donate back to the program to bring in all the special speakers from DC and to host the happy hour tonight. So I just really want to thank both of them for their time. And I saw one email about paper topics, and if people have questions about that, now that you're thinking about it and kind of getting into the meat of the material, feel free to grab me or Laura or Dale or Brian at a break or whatever and pick our brain on that. So, yeah. Does anybody have any burning issues now? All good? Happy?
Non-burning?
Non-burning?
Just itchy. No, just kidding.
But I'm
Yay.
So, all right, thanks.
All right, so, and also, I think Laura sent out an email yesterday correcting the desire to learn obligations so that you are not obligated to hop on there and talk. So you're welcome to do that, and that is a fine thing, but we determined after last year that that wasn't a terribly easy thing to do, and it didn't really facilitate the kind of exchange that we wanted, and since all of you are physically here, it makes it much better. So, and actually that is an important point we should also mention, is that Dale and I have been teaching this class for 8 years, and we change it every year, and we change it based on the feedback that you all give us. So if during the course of the class you're like, well, that lecture sucked, or that guest speaker could have been different, or I really wish we would have covered X, just kind of keep a running list of things that we can do different, or if like those readings didn't work or whatever. But we very much appreciate the constructive feedback because we do change the class every year to be reactive to what you all tell us. And you know, we have changed, for example, this desire to learn thing in response to people's feedback. So please do that. We appreciate it very much. So
you're not allowed to say no exams, though.
Yeah, that's not an option. We have scaled back the size of the paper, too. That's another thing we did, actually. So you should thank your predecessors for helping to make the weight that you have to carry less. OK, so before I actually get started on the lecture, I want to make a macro observation. I believe that spectrum management policy in the United States generally works well. Okay, so that is a overriding theme of what's going to happen during the course of this class. And so although we will be critical of it, and we will point to examples where it strains or maybe the system didn't work as well as it could, it does not change the underlying fact that I believe that by and large, decisions get made for the right reasons and relatively in the right way. So that's important. Dale and I often will debate on this topic because I think I'm probably slightly more optimistic about how the political process works than Dale. Is that fair?
That's fair.
OK. So you will see that tension emerge. But I don't want, particularly in light of today's readings, which I hope were at least as entertaining as most television shows, that you got a feel for some of the times it doesn't work. But it is not meant to be illustrative. And as we talked about yesterday, 95% of the time, these decisions are made without any of the hoo-ha associated with what was in the reading. So just to put a little bit of a overview on what's in the reading, does somebody want to just talk briefly about the readings on the, as we call it, the snakes on planes proceeding or the phones on planes proceeding? Anybody want to talk about that a little bit? Tell me what was in the reading, what you found interesting. Anyone? Sure, Julie.
Well, the three things we saw on it, I was interested to know, first of all, how the overlap between the Department of Transportation and the FCC authority works, because the Department of Transportation announced that it's seeking public comment on this proposed ban on voice communications, and the FCC is seeking to lift that sort of restriction.
Right.
And I thought it was interesting that they mentioned some of the companies that have put in a lot of money and resources to equip planes to have Wi-Fi access now.
Right.
So I just thought that the like overlapping authority was pretty interesting.
So obviously the class today is focused on external influences, and one of the external influences we're going to talk about is the executive branch influences on the FCC. If we were having a class that was focused on NTIA, we could have the same class, only FCC would be listed as something that influences NTIA, right? So we're doing this from one agency's perspective, but it could apply to any agency, so that's first. The DOT example is there because of that external influence from the administration. And you also saw the airline employees weigh in against talking on planes. That's another example of a trade association or public input that influences the process. And then you saw the press story from the New York Times, which, needless to say, was not terribly flattering about the proposal. So a couple interesting things about the phones on planes debate. First of all, it happened very early in Chairman Wheeler's tenure. It has been widely perceived as having been botched in terms of the rollout because he got so much bad press early. So it was a good example of how not to roll out a new initiative. The DOT piece was their effort to try and regain their footing because their argument was all the FCC was trying to do was come to a technical conclusion on whether or not phone service on planes would interfere with other radio services. Their mandate was not to decide the protocol for the use on the planes themselves. So the FCC, having been walloped in the politics of this, suddenly tried to get cover from the administration to have somebody else have the hot potato about how this should work. So you saw sort of all three stages. You saw a botched rollout, so press influence, right? Then you saw a rescue attempt from an external influence, the Department of Transportation, and then you saw the impact of the third party through the flight attendants union. I can't remember the name of the acronym of the group, but those guys. So that's why that one's there. We have a couple other interesting ones. On the white squared stuff, we included a light squared filing and opposition. Those are both very thick, as I'm sure you saw. The details of those filings aren't particularly important. It's just to give you a feel of what a comment looks like. So you don't need to have command over what everyone said as a result of the different arguments. The Save Our GPS coalition was amusing in terms of the branding, right? So they're suddenly saving our GPS as from some existential threat. And then you saw the follow-on, the Center for Public Integrity press story about the influence of the various groups involved in Light Squared, which was not terribly fairly written to Light Squared in my view, but nonetheless is part of the narrative. And then you also saw in the House Energy and Commerce Committee report, particularly pages 7 through 9, I would call your attention to, because that talks about the Light Squared proceeding. And the interesting thing there, that is an important lesson, that if I teach you only one thing during the course of this class, this is what I'd like for you to learn. Yeah, I've decided I have to be able to walk back here because otherwise you guys don't feel as uncomfortable as all of the others do, so that's where I'm going to go. Anyway, I'm going to end up falling back here. So but the point of that story is that, and the one thing I want you to remember is your emails to government officials are become public property, and everything you say could become a news story. So when you say, hey, let's meet for coffee because I may not be able to get you through White House security and you'll be on the logs, that's the sort of thing that ends up in a Commerce Committee report about your behavior and a violation of what is a perceived violation of the Obama Transparency Pledge. So when you're dealing with government officials over email, even though they're the people you're in this class with who are eventually going to be in government service, and you're going to be doing things with them, or if I end up back in government and Dale wants to meet for dinner to talk about something, or Laura comes to lobby me, or Tripp comes in on behalf of his evil monopolist to lobby me. In any case, you're going to have to you have to remember that once you go into that government email system, you've become public property and you've become a topic of public discussion. So I don't think anything untoward happened in Light Squared. I'm very confident it didn't. But the perception from those emails that's left is that something did. And once you undermine the perceived integrity of the process, you've done real damage both to yourself and to the organization in which you work. So those are high-stakes games, and I want to make sure that we stress that. The other things we have on there, you'll see the NBC-Comcast merger conditions, 26 pages of behavioral modifications to the merged company. Gives you a little bit of a feel of the types of conditions that are attached to mergers, something that we'll see as part of the Comcast-Time Warner discussion. Yes, Chris?
One other question I had about that is that something that Comcast and NBC came to the table with as to try and
So great question. We could probably have a whole class just devoted to the merger process at the FCC and the kabuki dance that is involved in doing transactions. In NBC Comcast, when the NBC Comcast deal was announced, Comcast had certain conditions that they agreed to out of the box. They said, as a result of this transaction, we will do the following 5 things. Just like in the way when they announced Time Warner, they announced that they're going to divest 3 million subs, right? So there are certain things that they brought to the table. And then you establish a public record, like so the merger application is put out for public comment, and all the groups come in. And this is what I call piñata time. So if you are somebody who wants something from Comcast or Time Warner, you get your stick and you come beat on the transaction piñata that's hanging there in the hopes that something falls out, some goodies fall out that you might want. So if you want computers in classrooms for your school, then you bang hard on that. If you want minority ownership and this, that, or the other thing, you bang on that. If you want a different deal on retrans or you want something different on peering, i.e. Netflix, you bang on that. So that's the piñata process. Once all the groups have done their thing and lobbied the commission, then eventually there's a conversation between the parties and the commission where they basically come to some agreements about what Comcast will volunteer to do, which is not really voluntary, as a result of the transaction. So then they submit their voluntary conditions and the commission largely ratifies them. So it is an elaborate dance, but there isn't anything very voluntary about it. And unfortunately, as long as the political process works that the piñatas sometimes break open, then you always have people banging on. I don't know, Daley.
That's absolutely. It's a chance to get your favorite.
And it may or may not be related to the transaction, which is the other thing that's mildly annoying.
It may be close to extortion, but not.
Not prosecutable. Yeah.
Like as far as like offering more TV channels and things like that seem to make a lot of sense to me. But the things about like offering or getting computers into classrooms seems sort of outside. I mean, when you want to do a merger like that, are you just exposing yourself to kind of these out of the realm sort of things?
And they've gotten, it varies from commission to commission. Like some deals you've agreed to like repatriate 3,000 jobs from Mexico. Like that's been a merger condition before. We ain't the Department of Labor. Like I don't know why that's in there, but it does because it doesn't have anything to do with anything. But, and you know, you said the channel thing makes sense to you, but is it really merger specific? I mean, do you really want Comcast to do that any more than you want Time Warner to do it or Charter or Cablevision? I don't know. That's obvious. If you want to have so this is, now we're getting into what I think is I think on a bipartisan basis, people mouth the same words. They just don't necessarily always act this way, which is that what you're supposed to do is if it's a merger-specific harm, then you have a condition. If it is a general industry-wide problem, then you're supposed to have a rule making and change it for everybody. What ends up happening, though, is because the companies are in this unfortunate position of being at the whim of what the agency wants, you get a lot of policy made in mergers. i.e. the agreement to do a net neutrality condition, right, even though the court struck it down. Okay? So that's the merger conditions. We're going to talk more about that. Wesley Clark's phone records, I referenced that the first day. Agenda setting by the press. I think I covered everything I was supposed to cover. Yeah. Oh, and then we got a few NTIA letters, which might seem at first kind of an odd posture because NTIA talks to the FCC all the time. Why are you sending letters to each other? But just like every other party, they have to put things on the record in order for them to ultimately be adopted by the agency, and we'll talk about why that works that way. And as the president's telecommunications advisor, that is the role they're playing, right? They are acting as his advisor and sending this letter advising the commission as an independent agency, as the fourth branch of government, about what they're supposed to do from the president's perspective because, of course, they're not part of the administration.
I would say that that's eroded a bit. In the old days when I was there, that was done very formally, and it's been watered down, I think, a little bit.
That's right. Other questions? All right, shall we go? Onward. All right, so we're going to do decision-making process first, then external influences, public trust safeguards, and reform. Yeah, okay. So just try and get in your heads this basic notion. And by the way, today's lecture is going to once again be a little more me talking than the later classes. So this week, as I think we previewed, Dale and I are going to be doing a lot more lecturing than we're going to do later in classes where we'll break you up into groups and stuff. But a lot of this is just trying to get information out into you so you can start to form opinions, but it's mostly the process as opposed to the substance, which we're going to spend more time on after these first 5 lectures, I think. Two major types of proceedings: general rulemakings, which we're going to focus on in the class more than the other, which is adjudication. So we talked before about the multiple branches of government being implicated. Rulemakings are quasi-legislative. So most often started because of a petition for rulemaking. Sometimes it's a statutory mandate, so Congress passes a law and says, Joseph, chairman of the FCC, we would like for you to start a rulemaking on privacy concerns, or we'd like to have Matt start a rulemaking on AWS-4 spectrum, or whatever. So sometimes it's a statutory mandate. Sometimes it's a group just comes and says, you really should start a rulemaking on X. So Kira would say, okay, I'm the head of CU students for cheaper cell phones, and I'm going to petition the FCC for a rule that says every cell phone service should offer an entry-level service level of $20. And you're going to file a petition, and the commission will put that up for public comment. So that's another way sometimes things start. And then finally, the FCC itself can just be sitting around and decide, hey, we really need a rulemaking on X. So Katie's sitting in the Wireline Bureau. She discovers that there's this tension between the way access charges work in one context and another, and says, hey, we should set up a rulemaking to solve this problem, goes to the bureau chief, makes a recommendation, et cetera, et cetera. So sometimes it can happen that way as well. So any of the three can prompt this quasi-legislative approach, and then you go through the process we'll discuss in a minute. Okay? And that's rulemaking. So that's like saying, when the agency says all cell phone providers will do X, it applies to a full class of people, right? So all the students in this class, for example, would be a topic for a rulemaking. An adjudication is much more specific, right? So it's Gil broke the rules because when he was porting cell phone numbers, it took a week to port numbers when people were switching to a competitor instead of the required 8-hour interval. And so there's going to be an enforcement action against Gil. That's involving a single party, so it's more quasi-judicial. So that's an adjudication. Other examples are, Chris wants a waiver of the rule about lighting his cell tower because of the impact on migratory birds, or a license transfer like the Comcast Time Warner thing, or if the AT&T T-Mobile effort. Those also are considered adjudications. Complaints, we just talked about those. Requests for a declaratory order and enforcement action all fall into this second bucket of adjudications. Okay? And then there's sort of this industry oversight quasi-executive function, which we actually added the last time. So it's a little bit of a blend of the two, but it tends to go more to the compliance side than anything else, and you'll see some examples of that going forward. Okay, so a little bit of each. And in case you didn't believe me, the Chief Justice of the United States also agrees. I'll just read out loud. One of the principal authors of the Constitution famously wrote, the accumulation of all powers in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Although modern administrative agencies fit most comfortably within the executive branch, as a practical matter, they exercise legislative power by promoting regulations, executive power by policing compliance, and judicial power by adjudicating enforcement actions and imposing sanctions on those found to have violated. The accumulation of these powers in the same hand is not an occasional or isolated exception to the constitutional plan. It is a central feature of modern American government. So it is why we recognize that it's a little strange, but it also is very much the way that all independent agencies have been set up. Okay? This came out, I think, during class last year, so it was a particularly nice little validation of our approach to how we teach this, because it was very succinct. All right, so rulemakings. And I'm going to walk through this in some detail, but do you have any questions about the three different types of functions the agency engages in? Or how the dividing lines work? Okay. All right, rulemakings. So we talked a little bit about how they're initiated, that various people can bring them, but the commission generally will launch them through a notice of proposed rulemaking, or NPRM. So you'll hear us use that term a lot, that there's an NPRM coming, and that stands for Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. It'll come out and it'll provide the details about the rules, as the name implies, about the types of rules the commission is considering. So Ashish has filed a petition for rulemaking that all cell phones shall be, what's your favorite color? White. Okay. All cell phones shall be white. So we're going to have a rulemaking about whether or not all cell phones should be white, and there's going to be a document coming from the FCC that talks about Ashish's petition. It's going to talk about the pluses and minuses about making all cell phones white, and if it's a good notice of proposed rulemaking, at the end, it will have a proposed rule about how Ashish's proposal will be implemented, that all cell phones should be white. And then that will be put out for public comment and published in the Federal Register so that all of you in this classroom, indeed everyone in the United States or indeed in the world, can comment on Ashish's proposal. Okay? Yes?
The FCC governing body can make such
Yep.
decisions for
Yep.
anyone. So
If you want to file tomorrow, we can get you filed. What do you want to file on? You want to do it tomorrow?
let's do that.
Okay, we can do that. You need to pick a docket, and we'll get it filed for you. But yes, anyone can file, and it's become increasingly easy. The transaction costs used to be a lot higher than they are now, but it's actually pretty easy to file. And in some dockets, there's a lot of, right now, for example, on this open internet docket, the servers were being brought down because so many people were doing things. The other very popular place for people to file is in indecency complaints. Millions of complaints over Janet Jackson's breast, for example. I was there for that one. That's a personal favorite. But there's yes, Ethan. Do you have a question about Janet Jackson's breast? No, it's a fair question.
Class live
But I will just. This is all being videotaped, by the way.
Yeah, it's inevitable. It's inevitable.
Yeah, and it's wardrobe malfunction jokes come to mind. No, just kidding. I was watching the Super Bowl that day with another friend at the FCC, and we were watching with his kids, and we were watching the halftime show, and both of us turned to each other and was like, did we just see what we think we just saw? And then the phone literally started ringing like within 5 minutes afterwards. I was like, oh, you've totally ruined my Sunday. It's really unfortunate, really, really unfortunate. And that's a longer story. Maybe I'll tell that during the happy hour tonight, but it's a good one. So anyway, so millions of people, though, filed about Janet Jackson's breasts or about Bono saying something was effing brilliant, et cetera. That is a major, in terms of the sheer volume of input from the agency, that is one where we get more input than almost anything else. Okay, so you have the rulemaking on cell phones, all cell phones being white. The public seeks comment. Usually it's like a 30-15 kind of schedule, so 30 days for people to file opening comments, and then you have a reply round. So the theory is that if Bill says something crazy in the opening round of comments, Michael gets to have a chance to comment on what Bill said. So there's there's supposed to be a dialogue between the opening round and the reply round. So that's how it's set up. So there's two rounds of comments, and you'll see. We'll talk a little bit about how this plays out in individual dockets. After those two things are done, so we have the opening comments, the reply comments. Then you can have what's called ex parte meetings. What does an ex parte mean? I believe this is a lawyer's question first. I need a hand. Can I have a hand, Julie?
It means where not all of the parties interested are present, like not all of, it can refer to like where not all the commissioners are present or where it's not official.
Yeah, let's stop at the not all parties are present. That works for us. Yeah, let's do that. So not all parties are present. So historically, like when you're in front of a judge, Judge Hatfield's up in front of the court. You have Vicki and I are arguing in front of him. I'm not allowed to pull Dale aside and start talking to him without Vicki being present because it's not fair to Vicki, right? So that, if I were to talk to Dale on the side, that would be an impermissible ex parte contact because I would be potentially poisoning the well in terms of Dale's objective consideration of the issues. In the rulemaking context, more often than not, the FCC says, we're to let there be ex parte contacts, but you have to talk about them. You have to disclose what you said. So these are called permit but disclose. That's that last part at the end. Permit but disclose, that's a term of art that you should learn, which means ex parte contacts are permitted, but you have to disclose them. So I go in to meet with the commissioner about the all cell phones are white proceedings. So Stefan's the commissioner. I'm going to go in to meet with him. He's been promoted today. And I'm going to meet with him and say why this white cell phone thing is crazy because my favorite cell phone color is red, and there's no way that they should all be white. And I'm going to tell all the reasons why she's proposal is crazy. And then I need to file an ex parte disclosure document, a letter, saying what I told to Stefan, who's the commissioner, and I will file that at the agency so that she can come back and say, well, he can respond to what I've said to Stefan and can go in and meet with him himself. Yes?
Isn't that gray? I mean, I can talk to you whatever, and I can write whatever.
Well, you could be, yes, you could be, let's see, You could not tell the truth. That is always true, but the system is designed so you will tell the truth. And if you don't tell the truth, you can get into trouble. So you do. So the way that would work is if you go and if I go and meet with Stefan and I said to him all cell phones should be red, but my ex parte notice said all cell phones should be black, Stefan should go to me and say that's not cool. That's not what you said to me, and I should have to file a amended ex parte notice. And that does periodically happen. It's not usually because people they're trying to be too cute. It's usually not that they're lying. They either left something out or incomplete facts or whatever. But there is an obligation on the government official to make sure that what I said is actually what got recorded in the ex parte notice. And there's another check on this, which we'll talk about in a second. Yes, sir?
Are there any inter parte reviews or
Say what?
any inter parte review or meetings?
So I can go and meet with, if I'm advocating against the white cell phone proposal, I can go meet with him anytime I want to, Ashish. It's just the government officials. Because the theory is the government's going to make this decision, and then they're going to have to they're going to have to explain why they decided what they decided. And so anything that they rely on that goes into that decision is supposed to be a part of the public record. So that's why that's written down. If Ashish changes his mind, that's his business. That's not something that the government needs to be worried about.
I'll just add that doing a lot of international work in developing countries, for example, that's one of the people are afraid to invest because they're afraid that the government will change the rules on them and therefore change their investment without them having a chance to influence the government. They know that there should be some possibility of the conditions changing, but they're afraid it'll be done without any kind of notice and done in secret. So this is an attempt in the U.S. to make sure that if you're going to change rules, it'll have a strong economic impact on people, that you give them an opportunity to have a fair hearing. So it really is important in terms of stimulating investment, I think.
Okay. Questions about this? Okay, so we had those ex parte meetings. Then what happens? Okay, so Joseph and Matt and Ethan are all the crack young lawyers in the, let's see, what bureau do you want to be in? None of them? Oh, now see, that's a little party poopery now. So come on, where do you want to be? You have to remember a bureau from yesterday. Public safety. Okay, so you three guys are in the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. Nothing says party like a little Public Safety, Homeland Security Bureau time. And you're going to review the record in this rulemaking and figure out what you think the right answer is, right? So you three have been working in Public Safety and Homeland Security for dozens of years, and you've got all this experience on a given issue like emergency alert or E911 or whatever, and you're sort of the first line of defense, the first line of review in the FCC's process. One thing that people who file comments and do ex parte meetings often are a little confused about is that somehow hundreds of people inside the agency read their comments. That is generally not true. In fact, it is usually very much three people that fit the profile of Ethan, Joseph, and Matthew, except usually they're not dressed as well. So as a general matter, it's a few people, junior level attorneys or people who have been there a long time, who have been working in the same area for, like I said, for an extended period of time, and they're going to be the ones who actually review all the comments. In most cases, the leadership of the bureaus and all that stuff, and certainly not the commissioner's offices, are likely to read what you write. Okay, so these three people become very important to your rulemaking process, right? Very important to develop a relationship with them so that they understand if they have questions about your comments, they call you, that you don't offend them in any particular way. Because in a lot of ways, for the same reasons we talked about yesterday, 95% of the time, what these three guys decide is what's going to end up happening. So the staff becomes very, very important in this, and people who, as advocates, forget that, do so at their own peril. Okay? Indeed. So the three amigos here, the three musketeers, do their review of all the comments that have been filed, and for our purposes, we're going to say it's the white cell phone proposal. And they're going to prepare an options memo for the people who manage them. So in all likelihood, they are in a division within the Bureau. Remember, highest levels, Bureau, then divisions, then branches. So that's the hierarchy. So they're going to prepare an options memo for the leadership of the division. Let's say Vic is the division chief. And so he's going to get a memo from the three amigos about what I like to decide amigos or musketeers. From the three amigos, and Vic is going to look at the options memo, and in all likelihood, the three amigos will make a recommendation about what the right answer is for purposes of the petition on white cell phones, okay? Vic's going to look at that, Okay, let's see. Ethan, what do you want the recommendation to be?
White cell phones are significantly safer and benefit the public.
Excellent. Safer white cell phones. Okay, so they're going to come to Vic with the recommendation that all cell phones should be white, and Vic is going to review it. What say you, Vic?
I like red.
Okay. Okay, so apparently this is the 5% where the staff doesn't prevail. And he's going to change the recommendation because he's been working with the Three Amigos a long time. They don't really know what they're doing. He's been trying to get them to leave his division forever, and he hopes that if he disempowers them enough, they will eventually want to go to the Enforcement Bureau and he can get them out of his hair. So he's going to disempower them and say, all cell phones are going to be red. I'm rejecting this recommendation. And the memo is going to go from the division chief up to the bureau chief, who's Vic's boss, who's going to review the recommendation coming from the division. Now, Stefan's the commissioner. He can't be your boss. That's tricky. You can't wear too many hats. Okay, so Gil is going to be the division chief. Or no, sorry, the bureau chief. So, Gil, you're the bureau chief. You get the recommendation from Vic. You probably don't know what the Three Amigos recommended. You only know that the division is recommending to reject the petition on the white cell phone and instead to require that all cell phones be red. What do you think of that? Do you want to agree with the recommendation or go back to white or make some other decision? You're going to go with red. Okay, so the bureau chief is on board. Gil, who's been appointed by the chairman, Chairman Hatfield, has been appointed by Chairman Hatfield. He agrees with the recommendation coming up from his division because he trusts Vic's judgment. So the bureau has its recommendation. So then what happens? Then, oh wait, I skipped it. Oh, sorry about that. I've actually missed a step here. Okay, so then Gil has his recommendation. He's the bureau chief. It now goes to the legal advisor to the chairman of the FCC. Let's make that, oh, Tripp's my evil monopolist. He can't be that. No, Bill, you can do that person. Yes, Bill is the legal advisor to the chairman of the FCC, Chairman Hatfield. Gil comes to you with his recommendation from the bureau saying red, right? We decided on red, yes, saying red. So you have to decide on behalf of the chairman's office whether you think red's the right answer or whether you think we should go white or do something else. What do you think, Bill?
No, red.
Red. By the way, there's clearly no right answer here, so there should be no pressure on what you decide. Gil seemed very troubled, and I was like, I don't. Anyway, so it's red. Bill says it's red. Now, Bill, big question for you. Chairman Hatfield's a very busy man. He's got protesters out front of the FCC camping out. He's got a big open meeting tomorrow.
Yeah, right.
All kinds of stuff
All
is
kinds
happening.
of distractions.
Is this the kind of issue that you need to take to the chairman before you say red's the right answer? Or are you confident that you're acting on behalf of the chairman and you can just run with it?
Run with it.
You're going to run with it. Okay. Chairman doesn't know what the hell happened. That's good. All right, I like this. So Bill says to Gil, now this is going to be harder. Bill says to Gil, who says to Vic, that's basically what's going to happen. Bill says to Gil, who says to Vic, go with red. Okay, so that goes back down. Chairman's office signs off. Three Amigos. Now, despite the fact you wanted white, you're now going to have to write an item that says why you're drafting. It says why red is the right answer. So the three of you are off. You're going to summarize the comments. You're going to talk about why things worked out the way they are, why red is the absolute right answer. Now, let me just say a couple things about what we just did here. This is basically how it works most of the time, but consistent with Dale's discussion about the engineering yesterday, it is not the way it always happens. So don't go work at the FCC and say, I can't believe that so-and-so didn't sign up. That's not that. That's it. This is the general response. It is not mandatory. There might be times where Vic's cut out completely, or Bill definitely goes to the chairman's office, or there's not even an options memo prepared, so Bill never even knows about it. Gil just decides to do it without it. There's all kinds of derivations on the theme, but this is the general process, and it does illustrate the hierarchy. So that's what we're doing here, okay? All right, Three Amigos are drafting. Vic gets the draft. How's it look? It's good? It's good? No typos and stuff? I heard Ethan's work can be sloppy sometimes, so I just want to check. You're out that day. You're not reviewing it at all. Okay, good. Vic's mailed it in to you, Gil. Now he's ready to go. You see, you got the draft. You're ready to go. And do you want to look at it, or you just pass it on to Bill? Pass it on to Bill. All right, you got everybody absentee. So the Three Amigos draft gets to Bill for Bill reviews, takes a look at it. You know, the sections that Joseph worked on look pretty good, so maybe it's all right to go ahead and circulate it. So we're done with it. You ready to circulate it? Is it okay?
Yeah, I read it. It looks okay.
Did you have a few edits?
Yeah, a few edits.
A few edits. Okay, so what would generally happen, which is why the three amigos are generally irritated with their jobs, is that Vic would have edited it, would have gone back, then Gil would have edited it and would have gone back,
Yeah,
and
right.
then Bill would have edited it and would have gone
Yeah,
back. And each
exactly.
time, not
Yeah.
necessarily with the same edits, they all be conflicting, of course. And the three of you would have to work all that out, and it becomes a pain in the neck. So especially the higher profile the matter. So if you're doing like the maritime item, you're not going to get a lot of edits. If you're doing open internet, you may as, I don't even know why you do a first draft, because you have to do it 16,000 times. And we haven't even gotten to where it gets worse. So all of that happens. You've got the edits. You've got the chairman's office sign off. Now, you've got, the three amigos have their draft, but before it can go to the other offices, Gil, there are other bureau chiefs who care. So Varen is also the chief of the office, the general counsel. You're the general counsel. How about that? We'll make the ITP guy the general counsel. Why not? So he gets to look at it, too, to make sure that the three amigos didn't mess up the law. And if he has a little policy bent, he might want to mess with it, too. Then Michael is the head of the Office of Engineering and Technology. He's a little nervous about the technological impact of it being white, and he's going to have some edits for the three amigos, too. So, and then maybe you get from the Office of Strategic Planning some edits. Maybe the International Bureau is worried because it might have an impact when you go to the ITU if somehow we're mandating what everyone's phone in the world is supposed to look like. So all of those people get to mess with it also. When all that's done, this is why everything takes a year or two, by the way. When all that's done, then Bill's going to make the decision that the other offices get to look at it. So then and only then. So the important thing to take away here is the chairman's office is really controlling the agenda here, right? The other offices don't know what the three amigos wrote. They don't know what Vic's recommendation was. They don't know what Gil's recommendation was. They don't know if the chairman knows about it or not, and they don't know when it's going to hit their offices. Okay? But at that point, when Bill's ready, he says, go. So this is the subsequent distribution to other commissioners, and this is what's called being on circulation. So if you look at the FCC's website, there is a circulation list that reflects the items that have started with the three amigos and gotten all the way to the point where Bill signs off on them so that they're being considered by the other offices. Yes, Dale.
Brian,
Mr. Chairman.
you never mentioned the role of the chief of staff in that. I think you said only legal advisors. And be candid, I'm not clear exactly of when the chief of staff would be involved and not.
So
It's a relevant question since that's one of the positions that
I held, yes.
Yeah.
So chiefs of staff are a wild card in this, right? So if it's something they're particularly interested in or something that's very politically sensitive, then they might get involved. I don't think most chairman's offices who are successful have them reviewing all items or even most items. So that is a wild card, though, and another person who could weigh in. And Bill, if he's not comfortable bothering the chairman, might go to the chief of staff instead and say, hey, I'm thinking of doing this. Do you think it's a problem? And the chief of staff might sign off so that Bill has a little bit of political cover but didn't actually bother the boss. And different chiefs of staff and different chairmen will have different relationships about how that works.
Thank you.
Yes?
What if Ashish wants to appeal against, the original proposal was that the color of all cell phones should be white.
Yes.
And midway, someone from the FCC changed it to red.
Vic, yeah.
Vic, yeah. So doesn't he have the right to appeal against this?
So we're going to talk about that in a second, because we haven't even gotten a decision yet. Ashish probably doesn't even know what's in the item yet. Okay, so he doesn't know. Nothing's happened just yet. All right, are we ready to go next stage? All right, so we have our 4 commissioners' offices now, right? So Katie, Commissioner Laura, I'm not going to do it. This is going to take too long if I do it. Okay, so these 2 are fellow commissioners. They get the item. They also have their legal advisors review it. And guess what they want to do? Edit! Yes, of course they want to edit. So the 3 amigos become increasingly irritated at the edits. And in fact, Katie's office decides that actually they should be white and actually thinks that they should vote with the Ashish. So now the 3 amigos go to brief that office to explain to Commissioner Katie why they should be red, even though the 3 amigos actually wanted them to be white, because that was their original recommendation. So that gives you some illustration and appreciation for the role of the staff in this, right? So you don't always get what you want, and you have to toe the company line when you go to brief Commissioner Katie. Now, Commissioner Katie may or may not be convinced when she's told that they're going to be red, so she may vote against it. But the goal, obviously, is to get to 3 votes and get a majority. So all the offices are briefed. All the offices have the draft item on circulation, as I said, consistent with that list that's on the commission website. Ashish knows it's on circulation because that list is public. So he might now come around and start to lobby, and Katie's legal advisor, being a good legal advisor in my view, might intimate to Ashish that, hey, you're going to lose. And Ashish might become more active. So he might start to get the press ginned up on why all cell phones should be white. Or he might try to bring in the, I don't know what this would be called, the pro-white labor movement on why that should be the case, or the public interest group in favor of whiteness. I don't know. They're bringing all these people. The white dye manufacturers, that would probably be a good one. White Plastics Anonymous. Anyway, they're bringing all those people to try and bring pressure to get it flipped, right? And then the red people are going to have the same thing happening on the other side, because they're all, so the battle will be joined. And Katie and Laura and the other commissioners are going to be in the maelstrom of this whole thing. So that happens. Then as Katie and Laura and the other commissioners reach their decision, they go into an electronic voting system, and they can vote any of a number of ways. They can vote in favor, and that's fine. They can vote against. They can do affirm in part, dissent in part. They can concur. All these things have different meanings. But obviously, yes and no are pretty easy. Concur in part, dissent in part get a little trickier. It basically means they agree with part of it, but not other parts of it. And they usually don't actually have to define which parts they agree with and which parts they don't. So it can become a little weird. It depends on the item, and you'll see some examples of this as we go on. A concurrence is a strange outcome because it says I agree with the result, but I don't agree with the reasoning. So I might also want the phones to be red, but I want that to be true because I'm a St. Louis Cardinals fan, right? So, but that might not be what the staff, Three Amigos, wrote in their explanation for why it should be red. So I might concur because I like red, but I would not agree with the reasoning. And that's why the commissioner's separate statements become important, because you get some insight on what their views are versus the other folks. Okay? So votes, 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 they all drop in. When all 5 commissioners have voted, an item is adopted. So adopted is a term of art, and you will see as we go through, we have some examples of this, an adoption date. And that is the date on which the 5th vote dropped. That is to say, locked in, and that's the date that it officially becomes adopted by the agency. Now, what often happens is when the commissioners vote, they vote with edits. So, in other words, Laura's going to vote yes, but it's yes with edits, which means I'm prepared to support this item as long as you take the edits that I put on the email chain or the edits I discussed with the staff. In many cases, all the commissioners will vote with edits, and all of those edits have to be reconciled. It may be easy. It might be a 5-page item, and there might be 6 changes in it, and some of them are typos that Ethan left in the draft or whatever. But in other cases, it might be a 300-page item, and there might be pages that are moved around and rationales that are different, and it becomes a much more complicated process. So there was a long, actually it ended up with a congressional investigation into the adoption and release of an item called the Triennial Review Order that had more than 6 months between adoption and release. And the argument in that case was that 3 commissioners had voted for it, 2 had voted against it, and the 3 that voted for it dramatically changed it over the 6 months that it was sitting in the commission, and the dissenters, when they voted against it, didn't actually see what ultimately was adopted. So there was a very strange cross-current in that, and the commission has become much better since that at getting the adoption and release things done relatively close together. But you'll still see on the cover of the items that you're going to look at that gap between adoption and release. And then you'll also see always the commissioner separate statements, because that's another thing that might take a long time, is that Laura might vote for the red cell phone item, but she might have a 15-page separate statement that isn't done, and we have to wait and wait and wait until that's done, even though the 3 Amigos have finished their work. We might have to wait and wait and wait until Laura gets hers done. Yes?
What if all the commissioners agree with edits?
All of them?
Yeah,
Okay.
let's say 3 of them agree and 2 are disagree.
Yep.
But let's say the edits are, let's say they are contradicting each other.
Yep. So in that case, the 3 who voted in favor are the only ones that can edit. So if you dissent, you're dissenting, and you don't get to say anything about it.
The ones that are agreeing, their edits are the ones that are flashing.
Okay, then the 3 offices have to sit down and figure it out. Because the 3 Amigos might try and take a cut at trying to figure out how to resolve them, but as a general matter, you might have to get the legal advisors to Katie, Laura, and Chairman Hatfield together with Bill, and then they'll try and work out a way that they all agree. Yes, but usually you don't vote until you know you have an agreement. So the legal advisor would have done a poor job if somehow there were conflicting edits and they somehow voted yes anyway, because they want to have that resolved before they cast their vote. Okay, other questions on this? Okay. I almost tried to advance the thing with my BlackBerry. Okay, so adoption release. So an example, AWS 4. Okay, so this is a relatively interesting case study. Back in the late, let's see if I can get this right. I think it was the late 90s, early 2000s. The FCC launched a service called the Mobile Satellite Service in the 2 gigahertz band. The details of this are not super important, so just let me run for a second on it. 9 different companies said we would really like to provide mobile satellite service in the 2 gigahertz band. Mobile satellite means that you could basically, the satellites move and you can move with your phone, right? So it's a potential to have a cell phone-like service up to a satellite. So there were 9 different companies who filed, and during this time, in order to get satellite spectrum, all you had to do is apply for it, okay? So there's, at that point, 70 megahertz of spectrum, 9 different companies, and the commission decides we're not going to decide who gets how much spectrum or who gets all the spectrum. We're going to divide the 70 by 10, which is very strange, by the way. Everybody gets 7 megahertz. And even though, since we have 9 companies, we'll leave 1 in reserve. And everyone's going to get 7 megahertz, okay? So very kind of innovative licensing process. Fast forward a year, and at that point, there's a lot more pressure, technological pressure, on getting more spectrum for wireless broadband, or for wireless service, I guess more accurately. And the commission, at this point after a year, of the 9 satellite companies, 5 have dropped out, bankrupt. Some have bankrupted, some have decided they can't build their satellites, et cetera, et cetera. The commission decides that of the 70 megahertz, I'm going to take away 30 and give it to cell phone companies, and I'm going to leave 40 for the mobile satellite service, okay? So I'm down to, what did I say, 5 companies? Mm-hmm. Is that right? Okay. No, I'm down to 4, right? 9 minus 5. Yeah, 4. I'm down to 4 companies, and I have 40 megahertz. So now everyone gets 10 megahertz of spectrum. And 30 megahertz goes to the wireless guys. So fast forward 2 more years, 2 more companies have gone bankrupt. There's 2 satellite companies left. They've actually launched satellites. And they each have 20 megahertz in this 40 megahertz slice of spectrum. They both go bankrupt. And by the way, they've never actually, one of them actually did kind of launch service and had a few thousand customers. The other actually never launched service. And we're now about 4 or 5 years from the original licensing regime. Both of them are in bankruptcy. And what happens, Charlie Ergen, our friend down the road, decides to buy up these 2 bankrupt satellite companies and get the 40 megahertz of spectrum. And what does he decide? He says, hey, this satellite thing really isn't working out. Everybody's gone bankrupt. It's kind of a mess. Why don't you let me have full flexibility to use that spectrum on the ground for traditional wireless service, not just for the satellite. Don't make me spend all this money on this satellite stuff. Let me buy these companies out of bankruptcy and use it for traditional wireless service. Okay, so who in the room, well, raise your hand if you think that they should have said yes to Charlie. Who said yes? Okay, why yes?
Why not?
You're a very laconic answer, Matt. You notice that? Can you give me a little more to go on than the why not?
If he's going to use it, that's more valuable than not using it.
Okay, so there you go. So this spectrum is not being put to public use. Therefore, we should allow him to put it to public use. What's the argument against giving it to him? Yes, Gil.
No, because it might allow for monopoly of stock, given that you won't buy one.
Well, he's buying up 2 bankrupt satellite companies, so there's no actual customer. So I'm not sure that particular works. I will call on Tripp as the evil monopolist in this context. And for this context, he's going to be evil wireless monopolist. Okay, go ahead.
Am I arguing for or against?
Against giving it to him.
Oh, well, the satellite didn't interfere with the GPS the way that the on-the-ground towers do. So, I mean, it's just a lot stronger signal, so there's a lot more of an effect on, like, public safety equipment, like the GPS in planes.
All true, except that that's the light square docket, not this docket.
Oh.
So this is not the one you read the comments about. This is a new story that I just spun out. It's very similar, but it's not the same one. It is a similar phenomenon, though. But what's the reason not to give him the rights, especially with the evil monopolist hat on? Yes?
With the evil monopolist hat on, if I'm already a cell phone customer, I don't want more cell phone customers in my market. So I want that satellite stuff to stay satellite.
Okay, so I don't want competition, but what's the other? How did you get your spectrum?
I probably got it through a lottery.
Okay, well now you're going back a little farther. In all likelihood, you didn't actually. So what is the main way that wireless carriers get their spectrum? They did. So what did they do? They paid billions of dollars at an open auction to buy the spectrum that was going to be used for wireless. What's Charlie doing?
Satellite spectrum by taking over some bankrupt company.
Which might result in a, Ethan? Yes, windfall. You're the windfall guy. Windfall. I would say. I know exactly. But so which results in a windfall. Sorry? Competitive advantage. So the theory is, if this 40 megahertz originally was designated for one purpose, which was satellite, right? So if you go out and acquire spectrum, and it's for satellite, and then all of a sudden you're allowed to use it for something else, and that seems a little bit unfair when other people went out and spent billions of dollars to get that spectrum. So let's compare it to land. So you go and you buy a parcel of land that's zoned for farming, and then you get the zoning changed so you can build a big mall, right? So is that fair? It's a windfall, right? Because you're getting a windfall from the regulatory change. So when is a windfall okay? Matt makes a compelling case, though. Why should I stick with satellite for this when no one's using it and I've got multiple bankrupt companies? It's in the public interest to put it in someone's hands who's actually going to use it. Or is it? Anyone else? Anyway, so this was the rulemaking that decided this, and ultimately the commission gave him the flexibility to use it. They agreed with Matt. His very concise representation of why he should get the spectrum. And the windfall arguments were made, but, and interesting because you invoke lotteries, one thing was noted, which is in many cases other wireless providers got them through things other than auction, and that ultimately is more in the interest to put it to use than to try and take it back. Because the alternative, if it's not fair to Matt, what do you do as the government? Charlie Ergen is in the bankruptcy court. He is buying assets out of that bankruptcy court. You can't just take that away, right? You can't just say, we're sorry you bought that. That was really stupid. We're going to take it away from you now. So it creates a weird dynamic for the government about how to solve the windfall problem. So what would you have done, Bill? Take it away from him or go with Matt?
I'd say property rights would apply.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means if he bought it, it's his.
But what he bought was the right to do the satellite service.
Right.
So the question is, should you give him more rights than he bought? Or should you keep holding them as the government?
I don't know.
With that?
You'd have to repackage it.
That would be the one way you could do it, right? Is you somehow could say, somehow you're going to take either some away. You could cut a deal with them, basically. You could try and take some of it away and sell some of it or try and make up the windfall or whatever. But Charlie, of course, would do what if you did that? And, yeah. And then you'd end up in court forever and a day. So then you have the transaction costs associated with keeping the spectrum out of the hands of the American people. We're going to talk a lot more about these kinds of issues, but I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive because this is the way that most of the rest of the class is going to go, is this kind of conversation. And once again, there's no right answer. You're just supposed to argue with me. Okay, so just so you know. All right, so here's what happened. NPRM was March 21st, 2012. This, by the way, was extraordinarily fast by FCC standards. The pleading cycle was announced on the 17th. 30 comments were filed. If you notice, there's 30 days in between. So that's the opening round of comments. And then 2 weeks later, so I told you about the 30-45 thing. So 15 days later, about 20 people filed reply comments on June 1st. The report and order was adopted at the open meeting, which we'll talk about that in a second, and released on December 17th. So 6 days between adoption and release. Remember that process where the three amigos are doing their thing. Published on the Federal Register, which makes it all official and clean on February 5th. And then petitions for reconsideration were filed on March 7th. We haven't talked about that yet. And then there were some other subsequent things which we can talk about later. So that's an example of the arc. I'm trying to remember if I missed this. Oh, yeah, I should have talked about this. Let me go back to one other thing from this point. The sunshine notice. So we talked about a scenario where Katie and Laura were voting on the item on circulation, we called it. And as soon as all 5 votes dropped, it's adopted, et cetera. The Chairman Hatfield, also could have decided that the all cell phones are white order should be on an open meeting. As I mentioned on Monday, by law, the commission has to meet once a month in a public setting. And when they meet, they adopt items, right? They vote on stuff. So tomorrow, they're going to vote on 3 big items: mobile spectrum holdings, incentive auctions, and the open internet NPRM. The chairman has decided that those 3 things are on the open meeting, which is why when Commissioner Rosenworcel and Commissioner Pai said they wanted delay, they were aiming that at Chairman Hatfield to try and push it back because it's his decision on what's on the open meeting. So there are 2 different ways that the white cell phone thing could be adopted. The one on circulation, where they just vote and it's done, or he can force them all to vote it on an open meeting, in which case Laura and Katie have to have the item 3 weeks in advance of the open meeting. So it goes to their offices in 3 weeks. They have 3 weeks to figure it out. A week before the meeting, the sunshine notice comes out, which means that we have to stop lobbying Katie and Laura and the chairman about the white cell phone item because it's going to be voted. So there's supposed to be a 7-day sort of cooling off period while they think through everything. And then it's voted in this public setting. So that's what happens tomorrow morning. Does that make sense? I can do more on that if you want. OK, so those are the 2 different ways it can work. All right, that's that. This is an example of this is the AWS 4 order. This is what it looks like. So adopted, released by the commission. You'll see sometimes, we haven't talked about this much yet, but sometimes, Gil, I forgot who my bureau chief was. Sometimes things are done on what's called delegated authority. So they can be done by the bureau, and you'll see that designation here. And then this is, obviously, the table of contents about what's there. They'll also mention if there are separate statements. That'll also generally be here. This is what it looks like in the Federal Register, which is the public notice that something's happened. I forgot what else I have in here. I think I have an ex parte in here, too. Oh, no, the ordering clauses. So you saw a little bit of this in the NBC Comcast reading. But this is what the ordering clauses look like for a given item. And it's very important, especially for the 3 amigos, to make sure that the ordering clauses are correct. Because not infrequently, the whole order will walk through a bunch of stuff, and then you get to the end and this is mucked up, and it'll be a particular problem in the Court of Appeals. So it has a variety of different obligations in it, including which statutory provisions are invoked. You see this ridiculously long line of Communications Act provisions that are somehow invoked as pursuant to this order, because they're invoking all of the provisions that might give them authority to do what they just did. Anyway, I always find that rather amusing. Anyway, so you see the various things here. So any questions about that? Oh, let me get back to this real quick. There's a bunch of stuff here at the end that I wanted to touch on for 1 second. So as a okay, I'm not sure why this actually was this case. Okay, so here you notice that it's treated as a permit but disclose. So they order permit but disclose on a going forward basis for this docket. You'll also see here the Wireless Bureau's delegated authority. So this is what I was just talking about earlier. Gil gets to mess with this to make the necessary changes in the database, so that the commission's not going to do that themselves. They're delegating that to Gil to go do it. International Bureau has delegated different authority to act on the petition for reconsideration. So there's another delegation. Now, it's important because Gil only has the authority given to him by the full commission. So unless it's delegated, he can't do it. So all the commissioners have to let him do it. Reg Flex and paperwork reduction. Where's that one? Reg Flex, and there should be paperwork reduction somewhere too. Oh, here it is. Regular flexibility analysis. These are 2 provisions that were created by Congress in 1994 when the Republicans swept into office. And they are designed to assess the impact of rules on small business entities in particular, and to reduce the level of paperwork in government. And we're going to see some examples later where the commission has gotten tripped up on messing up these 2 elements of what is generally a highly administrative function, but can also, catch you if you messed it up. So that's what that stuff is. Okay, so what must reports and orders do? So the 3 amigos are obligated to explain and justify the commission's decision based on the record and public policy. So if Ethan is, at home with his family and talks to his mother about how important having a white cell phone is, he can't rely on that representation in writing the order unless she has put something on the record saying she likes white cell phones, right? He can't be influenced and rely on anything that's not in the record in writing his order. So he can't write, because my mom wants it, unless there's something in the record that shows that his mom really wanted a white cell phone. Okay? So obviously that is a somewhat silly example, but there are other examples where you just have to make sure that, for example, earlier when we were talking about going to lobby Stefan, if I present some key tidbit of information that changes Stefan's mind, it doesn't do any good unless it ends up in the record, because it can't be relied on by the commission. And the court is only going to look at the things that are in the order. So you've got to make sure that if there's something the commission wants to rely on, it has to be in the record. It also must address all significant issues, particularly by those raised by parties. So if, now I got to remember who's going to be my lobbyist for the next thing. Duvall comes in and says, and he filed a letter saying, white is a problem because when people are driving with their cell phones, the sun reflects off white and will blind other drivers, then you, the three amigos, have to address that argument. Or Val's going to go to the Court of Appeals and say, hey, they failed to address my argument, and we're going to get reversed, and it's all going to end up back in the hands of the three amigos, who will undoubtedly be very cranky about having to deal with it again. So it's important that they go through the record and comb and make sure that every argument that is raised is addressed. Now, it does not mean that every single footnote needs to have a response, but the core arguments, the big things that are brought up, have to be addressed as part of the order. Must follow precedent. So if historically the commission has not mandated what color a cell phone must be, the commission needs to explain why suddenly it is changing course, right? So we used to not think cell phone color was important, but now because of the important fashion imperative of 2014, we need to make this change, or whatever it is, but they've got to explain the change in course, okay? You obviously cannot be in a violation of the Communications Act or the Administrative Procedure Act, right, the two key provisions that guide FCC rulemaking. It also must be a logical outgrowth of what was sought in the NPRM. So she said, I want all cell phones to be white. You cannot then decide that all cell phones have to have a GPS chip, right? It has to be related to what the petition talked about and what the notice talked about, because it's not fair to the public to have a notice of proposed rulemaking on one topic and then decide something else. Because if I care a lot about GPS chips, I don't know that when you're talking about white cell phones, you're eventually going to address GPS chips. So you have to give full notice to the public to do that. Okay? So that logical outgrowth is a term of art that's important. And then the summary of all rulemaking orders has to be published in the Federal Register. Okay? How are we feeling? Good? It's a lot, though, right? Okay, that's right. Let's see how we're going here. I think. Make sure I didn't miss any color here. Okay. External influence here. Okay, any questions about the decision-making process? We're going to come back to this a lot, but I just want to make sure better if we nail it down now if we can. Okay, ready? Yes, sir, David.
So the logical outgrowth, the final rule must be the logical outgrowth?
Yep.
So nothing can be in there that's extraneous, not even, it has to be exactly from that notice proposed rulemaking.
Right, so Shishi's rulemaking, or sorry, a petition is all cell phones should be white.
Right.
You can probably get away with making them red, as long as you're sticking to the color of the cell phones, right? So that's the logical outgrowth. It doesn't have to be.
You can't put something about having a grip on, I'm just making this up, but having like a grip on it, or
right, exactly.
dimension to it.
Right. And you'll see sometimes they'll game it a little bit, and they'll make the rulemaking really broad, and then you get into some grayer areas about that.
Yeah.
That is an issue. Joseph?
So in this whole comments section, you were saying in the AWS 4 thing, there were 30 initial comments and then 20 replies. And so the FCC doesn't actually have to reply to those in the comment period. They just have to address the comments in the final draft.
Exactly. By the way, I should have explained. AWS is Advanced Wireless Service, and 4 is that they've had 4 different bands that they've devoted to this. The FCC is very bad with branding, so it's very hard to keep track of what everything is, but that's what that is. AWS 4 is the 4th band dedicated to advanced wireless services. And oddly enough, we're about to have the auction for AWS 3, which came before but didn't. Anyway, so it's just very confusing. So that's what that is. Okay? All right. External influences. We're going to go through all of these. Courts, Congress, executive branch, states, international consumers, industry, and the press. Okay? And all the macro here, once again, as I mentioned before, this is external influences to the FCC. I could just as easily make it the agency, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, or I could make it the NTIA, or I could make it Congress and talk about how other people influence it. It's just all of these groups are involved in policy making in general, and this is just the lineup for the FCC. But I could do it for any agency. It's not like we're particularly unique. It's just a case study in how external influences work, okay? And the reason it's important for all of you is that when you end up in jobs in these companies and you're trying to change public policy, these are all levers, tools that you can use to influence policy. So if you're not getting the answer that you want from the FCC, you might go to Congress and yell to them. Or if you're not getting, let's say you've got the FCC on your side, but you want to play defense, you want to make sure the consumer groups weigh in your favor. But there's lots of different sort of chess pieces that you can use to try and get the outcome that you or your company want. Okay? Michael's yawning, so that seems like a bad sign. You okay back there? Get you some caffeine or something? I'm fired up here. We're ready to go. All right, ready? All right, courts. All right, so we talked about this in the context of comparative hearings on Monday. A party unhappy with what the FCC has done can challenge it in court, okay? And we'll talk about which courts in a second. On the basis the agency has issued regulations that are inconsistent with the statute, which is usually the Communications Act, or they can say that the procedures were not properly followed, which is the Administrative Procedure Act, okay? So something wrong with the Communications Act. So the Communications Act says, you know, that, I'm trying to think of a good example, that there's a mandate that all rates must be reasonable. And so you could say, well, it violates the statute because these rates are not reasonable. And you would take that to court. Or you could say, the rates are fine, but the commission didn't seek public comment in the proper way, or they failed to consider all the arguments, or it's not a logical outgrowth. That is, you can attack it on procedure, or you can do both, okay? The courts, for the non-lawyers in the room, there are generally 3 layers: District Court, Court of Appeals, and Supreme Court. FCC decisions generally skip the first part, the District Court, and go straight to the Court of Appeals. There are some exceptions to that. Usually it's the DC Circuit for a host of reasons that we won't get into because we don't need to. But as a general matter, the DC Circuit gets a disproportionate number of the cases because of how Congress decided where the cases go. There are some advantages to the DC Circuit because the DC Circuit sees a lot of these cases. They have developed an enhanced level of expertise when it comes to FCC matters, so you tend to get a more sophisticated bench than you might get if you go to the 10th Circuit here in Colorado or what have you, or the 8th Circuit back home in Missouri. They just don't see as many of these cases. They tend to not be as familiar with the technology and what have you. Okay. This is an example of a Court of Appeals case before the DC Circuit. You see the petitioner, or the appellant rather, the Alpine PCS, suing the FCC. And you see that let's see where it is. Those are the 3 judges before it's being argued in front of, and that's from September 2013. Just an example. Okay, so any questions about the court process? And then if you lose in the Court of Appeals, you can try and take it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court does not have to take your case, so most cases don't go up. Most cases end in the DC Circuit. But there are cases that do. In fact, there's a FCC-related case going up now. T-Mobile is appealing something related to tower siting, about what the requirements are of a municipality when they reject an effort to put a tower up, and what's required by the Administrative Procedure Act. So that's an example that we right now will have another case in front of the Supreme Court. Aereo is another example, although that's not a pure FCC case. And there are lots of others. As we mentioned Monday, the Brand X decision was a Supreme Court decision. So it's a good example of that. And the Supreme Court looks at a lot of these indecency cases too. So, okay, any questions about the courts? Okay. All right, external influence is Congress. So bicameral, 2 houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. House of Representatives obviously designated by population. There are 7 for the state of Colorado. So what can Congress do to the FCC as an external influence? Well, they could change the law to override an agency decision. So in the early 2000s, the FCC moved to modify its media ownership rules to allow for a company, any company, to hold broadcast licenses. It used to be that the rule was 35% of the country could, sorry, let me back up. The rule used to be that Littman Broadcasting could control broadcast stations around the country covering up to 35% of the population. That rule had been in place since the late 70s, and the FCC decided in the early 2000s that the market had changed. We now have cable, we now have DBS, that we have cable channels that reach 100% of the population, right? So the theory was that Littman Broadcasting should be allowed to not just broadcast at 35%, but they should be able to go up to 40%, okay? Extremely controversial. There were some other rules that were also changed, including the newspaper broadcast cross-ownership rule and a few other things. But the media ownership rule, that rule, the Littman Broadcasting rule, was very controversial, in part because Rupert Murdoch owned News Corp, and many people are not big fans of Rupert Murdoch, as you may know, and so it became this sort of firestorm. So Congress stepped in and passed a law that said the FCC is not allowed to change the media ownership rule to limit the reach of broadcasting beyond 38%. So 35 is okay to change 35, but 40 is too high, so we're going to do 38. And that was an example of Congress overriding the agency's decision-making and basically saying, we know better than you, and this is how this is going to work. Okay? So there are other examples. And the next one is a good one, too. So Congress also controls the budget. So an example of this is, when I was at the FCC, my commissioner, Commissioner Abernathy, was chair of something called the Joint Board on Universal Service. The Universal Service Fund is about an $8 billion a year program and ballooning in size. And one of the reasons it was ballooning in size is that the FCC was not only subsidizing a single phone line to people's houses, it was subsidizing multiple phone lines to someone's house. So Bill has his mountaintop retreat in, I don't know, what's a good mountaintop city we can put you in? Give me a city. Sure, Durango. Mountaintop city in Durango. He's got 6 phones subsidized by the Universal Service Fund. Commissioner Abernathy and a bunch of other people, state commissioners and another commissioner on the FCC, developed this joint board recommendation that said Bill should only be allowed to have 1 subsidized phone. A seemingly rational approach to controlling the size of the fund, in my humble view. However, and we'll talk about why this was important in a second, Senator Stevens from Alaska, who gets a lot of universal service money, decided that this was an outrage, that his constituents in Alaska are entitled to multiple phone lines just like people everywhere else, and therefore he was going to, as chair of the Appropriations Committee, block Commissioner Abernathy's recommendation. But he didn't run the Commerce Committee, which is the committee that has jurisdiction over the FCC. He ran the Appropriations Committee. So what did he do? He said the FCC is not allowed to spend money implementing Commissioner Abernathy's recommendation. And that's how they stopped him. So the fund continued to balloon out of control, and they're still trying to get back under control. But the one-line thing never did go into effect. It's never been limited to 1 line. OK, so another example. Well, we talked about this. One other way that Congress influences, of course, is that, as we talked about on Monday, the minority commissioners are often picked from, as a result of recommendations from congressional leaders. So there's a direct line between people on the Hill and commissioners. And when we ran through the lineup of the 5 commissioners the other day, you probably noticed O'Reilly, Pye, Rosenworcel all worked on the Hill, and Commissioner Clyburn's father is a member of Congress. So as you can see, there are ways in which Congress influences the commission that is a little softer than the first 2. And then the last one is also particularly interesting. Congress can audit the FCC or provide ongoing oversight. So we saw that Energy and Commerce Committee report that you read, the one where we talked about earlier about the lack of transparency in the Obama administration. That's an example of oversight. Another example is, I believe it's May 20th, and Laura will send around the notice of this. The House Energy and Commerce Committee is doing an oversight hearing for Chairman Wheeler, which is bound to be an unpleasant experience for him, I can assure you. So that's coming up on the 20th. It'd be fun if folks get to watch part of that, and we'll put up the information so you can find it. I think 20th is the right date. Is it right, Laura? Yeah, Bill?
What's the practical effect of oversight?
Pain.
Oh, it's awful.
And Dale, I want Dale to talk about this for a second. But you correctly point out that there is no actual impact, right? If it's bad press, it brings political pressure. It can be embarrassing, but it doesn't change the law. It doesn't change the money, or it doesn't fundamentally alter anything. But it can make your life unpleasant, and enough unpleasantries sometimes make you change course. Dale? Yeah,
exactly. It's so unpleasant. It's so unpleasant. It bound to influence how you think about things. It's a most uncomfortable thing. You go up and you've done everything honestly and everything, and they question, your parenthood. And, I'm exaggerating only slightly. It's a very unpleasant position to be put in. And if they're playing really, should I say dirty? Yeah, really, they will ask you questions that the hearing wasn't set up to even address. They've got some problem. I remember going up there once, and somebody had a device that was at the lab, and the lab hadn't processed the device thing, and so I got attacked. Well, here I am. I don't know every device that's pending at the lab.
It would be disturbing if you did, right? It's
Yeah,
not a good use of your time, right?
yeah. I got beat up. I got beat up mercilessly. Well, my constituent out there is waiting for this, and you've had it in the lab for, it's not a pleasant, situation.
And it is increasingly, I don't know, maybe this is my idyllic view of how it used to be before I was involved, but now that there are cameras involved, it becomes much more showmanship driven.
Yeah, it does.
And so there can be, at times does not appear to be driven by the effort to find out the facts, but rather to make a point.
Make a point.
And so you frequently will have people, especially if they think they have a smoking gun on something or another, where they found out some staffer leaked something to them that they think is a smoking gun. Isn't it true that you spent this amount of money? And that does happen.
Who's the congressman from New Jersey? In New Jersey, didn't have a television station, and no matter what we went up on the Hill, no matter what the topic was, he would he would attack the fact that we had not given New Jersey, and it is not exactly easy in that part of the world to move television stations around. I mean, we could argue that maybe New Jersey should have one, but it's not an easy thing to do it. But
so the problem being New York and Philly.
So he's putting pressure on us, because it's so uncomfortable going up there. You'd like to maybe do something so that the next time you get beat up, you can say, well, we're working on it, or do something. So he's influencing it. He did influence it that way.
And this is a really interesting example, because in all likelihood, there is no one from New York or from Pennsylvania who's lobbying against New Jersey getting a television station. But rest assured, as soon as I was thinking of Senator Lautenberg, it may not have been. But
McGuire
could have been. Anyway, so but if Dale gave in and they decided to find a way to squeeze a television station into New Jersey, as soon as it starts interfering with Philadelphia and New York, then you get the pressure the other direction. So it's a good example where there's only pressure in one direction. And that, in my view, can often lead to bad policymaking, because Dale is basically defending the New York stations and the Philly stations by saying we don't have room for New Jersey, but he's the only one defending them. And that creates a political imbalance. And there's no reason that a congressman from New Jersey is going to really care what Dale's defending. He's just worried about trying to make the political point that I need a station in New Jersey.
Yeah, because now, back in the press, the local press in his area says, senator or congressman, whoever wants to get fighting for New Jersey. That's good press in an election, right before an election. So, in the old days when it was better, Brian, we would often be told that we're going to beat you up, but don't take it seriously. This is just, we're just doing our job. And children's television was one of those things where people really realized that there were serious constitutional problems of doing too much, and they knew it, but they wanted press back home that they were doing something, to protect the children. So you would go up there and just get beat up and
take it.
You just take it.
And that still does happen. There are still back channels that say, I'm going to beat you up like crazy about this, but it's just the way we're working today.
Don't worry about it too much.
Don't worry about it too much. That definitely does still happen. And generally, many offices will tell you in advance what the areas of questions are. But to Dale's point about the equipment certification thing, if someone's just out to embarrass you, it's not hard to do, because there's so much stuff they could ask you about. No human is going to possibly know all those things.
Even though you go up there with a briefing book, it's that thick, and you got your staff person sitting right behind you to whisper over your shoulder, you still can't know everything.
And it sometimes is, something like, what's your position on X? But other times it's like, isn't it true that you have members of your staff working on X? Or isn't it true that you were talking in the White House about Y? Or isn't it true, that you met, whatever it is? So there can be a lot of gotcha on this stuff. So, including like where the budget's being spent and things like that. Okay, any questions about this?
Were you going to say something about the General Accountability Office later on? Because that's the way the Congress, too, can send the GAO. Yeah, and it's very uncomfortable to have the GAO down in your office looking over your shoulder.
So the GAO will often be asked by Congress to issue reports about various things, and they'll run off and do that, and that's another way they can bring pressure to bear.
Pressure on,
a good summary. Yeah, I don't actually. Can you make a note the way I put GAO in this for next year? I did add some stuff this year, but I didn't have that. All right, so Senate Commerce Committee, I'm stopping. I'm going to do this relatively quickly, and I think Congress will be our last one before we take the break. Is that what state you're from matters a lot. So when Verizon was selling its landlines to a company called Frontier in a number of different states, one of the states it was selling was West Virginia. I can assure you that Verizon is providing really, really good wireless service in West Virginia today, in part because they really, really, really wanted to sell their wireline interests, and they knew they needed to make Senator Rockefeller happy because he chairs the committee. So for years, West Virginia has gotten good stuff because of the role Senator Rockefeller has played in telecom. And much in the same way, previously the two chairs of this committee were Ted Stevens of Alaska and Daniel Inouye of Hawaii. And I can also assure you that there was a lot of attention paid to Alaska and Hawaii telecom issues during their chairmanships. Every FCC chairman, I think maybe for 2 or 3 decades, went on a fishing trip with Ted Stevens to Alaska and experienced what the telecommunications needs were in Alaska and got a upfront view of what that is. Now, I do not mean to say that there are not significant and distinct telecom issues in Alaska, because there are, and it's horrible, actually, the challenges of trying to connect Alaska. And in some ways, some of that attention is very much justified. But I am saying that when somebody's the chair of the committee from a given state, that will get more attention than it would if they were just another member of the committee. Okay? Senator Rockefeller is retiring this year, so there will be a new Democratic chair. It's not clear who that's going to be yet. But then the center of gravity will shift to another state, and suddenly every demonstration project will be happening in whatever that state is instead of West Virginia. So, people joke sometimes, not joke. In election campaigns, you'll see sometimes that people use incumbency, like the benefits of incumbency. This actually is a very tangible example of a benefit of incumbency, because as someone becomes more senior, they do get more attention, and they do get sort of soft power from people like the FCC and et cetera.
Another place where you see this is in the old days on the Bell system. They put their manufacturing plants in all the key congressional districts, and so therefore they were getting an awful lot of support from all around the country, because every congressman had a stake in what you were doing, and it made it more challenging to do anything that would be perceived as hurting the company.
All right, so that's so Commerce Committee on the Senate and the House side are the two that have primary oversight responsibility for the FCC, okay? So this is House Committee. Fred Upton's the chair, Henry Waxman, who's also retiring, as the ranking member from California. And then there's a subcommittee, Greg Walden, former broadcaster from Oregon, is the chair. Anna Eshoo is the ranking member from California, okay? But by the way, these are great places to get externships. Particularly, they enjoy getting engineers, by the way. So if there are any engineers in the room who are also interested in policy, some people have had very good experiences on Capitol Hill working in these, because they just don't often get engineers.
Yep.
Lawyers are a dime a dozen, but engineers, now that's something special.
Yeah, I always said I can place every engineer who's interested in policy.
Yep.
And that's,
Yep, absolutely. So if we do our job in this class, we'll get a few of you will be on the Hill soon. All right, so appropriations, why is this important? As we mentioned before, much in the way Ted Stevens said, I'm not going to let you spend money on X. These folks have the purse strings on the appropriations side. There's also a general government financial services overview committee in the Senate, and you'll see who those folks are. House Committee Appropriations, same thing. That's where the money comes from. Same thing on the Oversight Committee there. Judiciary. This is important for mergers. So when they just did a hearing on Comcast Time Warner Charter, SpinCo, or however many different companies are involved in that deal, that's the committee that looks at it, but they're looking at it from an antitrust perspective. Okay? So that transaction will have hearings both on the Commerce Committee side as well as the antitrust side to explore what the issues are in the deal. Same thing on the House side. Good Latin Conyers. By the way, I don't. People probably aren't following the news. Has anybody heard of something about John Conyers lately? Does anybody know this story? It's just a little vignette. But so John Conyers has been in Congress for 40-some-odd years, and he's ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, African-American, I think head of the African-American caucus. And he's running for re-election in his district in Michigan, and as part of that, you have to submit 2,000 signatures to get on the ballot. He submitted 2,000, but the people who collected the signatures have to be registered voters in the district, and his weren't. So he ended up under the 2,000 limit. So he, at the moment, will not be on the ballot next year, and he may well, as a result, not be returning to Congress. But this is attention
Who was
to
his
detail.
lawyer?
And I say this to lawyers all the time. Engineers are generally even better because you guys are more technical. But attention to detail is very important. And when it's something as important as getting on the ballot, you might want to make sure you got all your T's crossed and your I's dotted, because it is super, super important. So a 44-year congressional career ending in embarrassment because you couldn't figure out how to get the number of signatures correct.
So sad.
It was a sad way to go, right? Now, he may do a write-in campaign. There may be other ways to solve for it, but it is the very least an unfortunate embarrassment. So, all right. So
Could I add one?
Yep.
Just if you're a lobbyist and you want to try to stop legislation, what Brian just said is real important, because if the legislation has to go through all the different committees, one of the ways of playing the game is you get serial review, and you know, you can really, it's one of those ways of slowing down the process.
So, and actually there's a nice parallelism to what we were talking about earlier. Remember we were talking about the all cell phones are red proceeding, and we talked about the bureau chief having it, and but now the general counsel wants to see it, and now OSP wants to see it, and now OET wants to see it. It's the exact same thing on the Hill. If you're trying to lobby and you're trying to prevent what the bureau chief wants to do at the commission, you're going to go get Mike involved because you want OET to kind of second guess it and change it, and you're going to try and get as many people involved as you can to gum up the works. On the Hill, it's the same thing. If the Commerce Committee is trying to pass legislation that you don't like, you want to get another committee interested in it where they think they should have jurisdiction over whatever the issue is. So there's a big, because it's all about territory and about, what's the right word, sort of institutional heft. And so if somebody thinks that another committee is intruding on their bailiwick, they'll come out, loaded for bear. So too in the commission. So you can often bank shot things by using other institutional players. Yeah. Okay? All right, so we've done a lot. We're on slide 25. We'll see how this goes. We'll do our normal 15 minutes, but let's make it 13 minutes. So let's come back at 20 of, and then we'll do the 50-minute sprint for the end. Okay? Have a good break. Good. Bit. Lots of different people involved. We did it yesterday in the overview. One thing about, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the antitrust or the merger review, that is a particularly distinct procedural process that we'll talk about in some detail, because it is different, and it's the biggest cases end up with that split responsibility. So it's the FCC on one hand as well as DOJ and FTC. Okay? And let's start with the White House. So they can issue executive orders, which can bind federal agencies. So you'll see in some of the readings we're coming up with, the president issued executive orders putting more spectrum, doing a little shopping there, Joseph, and putting more spectrum into the commercial hands. So the executive order saying find 500 megahertz of spectrum, and that was something, for example, that he can direct agencies to do. Most of the policymaking work happens in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, headed by John Holdren. The National Economic Council, Jeff Zients, is the guy who was called in to help rescue Obamacare and save the website. That's also where your dean, or the Dean Weiser, used to work. The Chief Technology Officer, Todd Park. That is a Obama administration creation. There didn't used to be a Chief Technology Officer, so that's an innovation of this administration, and I think generally well received. And then the Office of Management and Budget, Sylvia Burwell. And the OMB folks have responsibility for those Paperwork Reduction Act things we talked about, and cost-benefit analyses, all of which are done through OMB. So, for example, when Chairman Martin at the FCC decided that he was going to force wireless carriers to put in backup power, the carriers appealed to OMB and said that they hadn't adequately taken into account the paperwork reduction and the burden on small businesses, and it got turned back. That is an extraordinarily rare outcome, but it is yet another place. So you've done all the different things we talked about to try and win in these various different dockets in different ways, and finally something comes out of the FCC, and you can actually potentially go to OMB and say, oh, but they messed this up, and turn it back. So it's just another lever and another way in which the executive branch interacts with the independent agency. Once again, independent agency. So the executive branch is not supposed to tell the FCC what to do, but in virtually every administration, as long as I can remember, and I suspect as long as Dale can remember, there have always been accusations that the president told the chairman of the FCC to do this, and how could he do that? And it's a horrible transgression of the independence of the agency, which is really a bunch of hooey in my view. But you know, for example, Julius Genachowski, the last chairman, went to the White House a lot. Well, he and the president went to a law school together. They're friends. It does not create a conspiracy that he goes to the White House a lot, right? People are chosen to lead agencies in part because of relationships with the president. I don't find it to be particularly troubling that they have relationships, but whether it's Democrat or Republican, there is invariably this tension that the president is telling the FCC chairman or commissioners what to do.
Particularly difficult, of course, when you have the one party controlling.
Right, divided government, right? So the Democratic Senate is not going to beat the bejeebers out of Tom Wheeler because he's getting influence from President Obama. The Republican House might.
Well,
so that's true. In divided government, it's particularly.
They'll look at those visiting logs and things like that. Yeah.
Which is why, consistent with the that Energy and Commerce Committee report about the guy wanting to meet at the coffee shop and not getting the White House logs, that's an example of how people might bypass the limits on that in order to make it happen. So now, there are reasons why you don't want, let me say it differently. Congress believes that the FCC is its creation. So that is why they resent the idea the president's going to tell them what to do. Members of the cabinet, the Secretary of Commerce, are supposed to work for the president, right? Penny Pritzker is supposed to do what the president tells her to do. This is supposed to be different than that. So I imagine there's some limit on, at some point the president told the chairman to do everything, and I guess I would be disturbed too, but I just don't find it to be sort of the terribly troubling. I don't know, do you have a different view?
Well, we might, some of this goes back to political interference in broadcast station licenses and stuff like that. And if you get to anything regarding content, you know, some remark by the president that this network is not treating this administration right, you know, the next time you get a chance, you know, hit them. I'm not saying that would happen, but I kind of like some separation there for that reason, primarily because going back to allegations of political interference by the White House in station renewals and things like that.
And I don't know if this is apocryphal, but I believe LBJ, right, denied, somebody came out against LBJ when he was running for Senate in Texas or something, and the broadcaster irritated them, so he leaned on the FCC to pull the license, and then it got granted to like Lady Bird's, his wife's family or something. Is that more or less the right?
Yeah, that's something. Yeah.
So that, I agree, that's a problem. My point is, if I don't find it particularly bizarre that the President of the United States is going to tell Tom Wheeler that he believes in the open internet, right? I mean, it was in the platform. So like that I don't find is troubling, but right, to Dale's point.
And of course,
anytime the government is used as an instrument for political
I'm not a good lawyer. If I was going to continue that argument, then I would say, but with the internet and stuff, it's increasingly how we get our content and so forth, and therefore, while my concerns were narrow before, just dealing with broadcasting, now I would argue, hey, in some ways they may be broader. But
we can get that to the next one. All right, so this is some examples of the White House stuff. Any questions about this? Okay, executive branch, NTIA. So NTIA is housed in the Department of Commerce. It is headed by Larry Strickling, who's the Assistant Secretary for Communications and Administration. So that's his little organizational box. This is sort of the echo of the thing we did before. So this is federal government spectrum. So we're going to talk a lot about federal government spectrum during the class, and this is where that set of issues is decided in the first instance. So there's a Director of Spectrum Management. I can't actually read this because I'm too close to it. Congressional Affairs, Public Affairs. What's that one say? International? Okay, yeah. Anyway, so this is the lineup inside NTIA. NTIA is much, much smaller. It's about the size of a bureau. It's just a few hundred people. I can't lecture with gum, it turns out, Vicki. And my throat's sore. Anyway, so this is relatively small. So that's, like I said, that's about 250 people. Okay? Larry's a presidential appointee. He was a former bureau chief at the FCC. He was formerly the head of the Washington office of Ameritech, which was Gil, what was Ameritech? Answer to a trivia question 2 days ago. Or maybe it was yesterday. 2 days ago? Okay. Anyone? Yes, sir. Our-Box, Regional Bell Operating Company. Wasn't that you? Who tried to get the regional bell? I could have sworn that was you. It was him, yeah. I think it was you too. Pretty sure you knew there were 7. Okay, so anyway, did you get a key ring or not? No, you got lifesavers? Yeah, see, you won. Okay, there you go, yeah. I'm not exactly going crazy on that front anyway. So Larry was the head of the Ameritech Washington office. He worked at level 3 here in Colorado, or for the company in Colorado. He left and went to work in Chicago for the campaign for about a year before Obama was elected. He was the head of the issue development stuff, and then immediately slid into the job at NTIA. And is out here periodically because NTIA has a facility just down the road.
And always attends our February event, too. I think he's always come to our February.
Yeah, he always comes in February. And actually, this time we won't have it. But are we having a SISMEC meeting here this summer or not?
I kind of assumed we were, but now you asked me, I'm
okay.
not
But anyway,
sure. Yeah.
Dale and I will talk about this in a second, but we're both, well, anyway, I'll talk about it in a second. But we have meetings here for NTIA, and you'll probably have a chance to meet some of the leadership there. Okay, so what does NTIA do? ICANN, you've seen a big controversy about this, about how the internet should be governed. That is an NTIA Department of Commerce issue. Broadband stimulus, they were responsible along with the Rural Utility Service for distributing all of that money. The IRAC, so the Interdepartmental Radio Advisory Committee, or IRAC, is an acronym that will undoubtedly come back to our conversation during the course of the class. All of these departments are represented. Why are they all represented? Kira, why would they all be represented? Because they're national. So it's an Interdepartmental Radio Advisory Committee, and all of these people are on. So what do all of those agencies have in common? They all are government spectrum owners. So all of them have, for various uses, something related to radio. So whether it's the radios inside the postage delivery trucks, or it's the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which does international stuff, the Coast Guard, FAA, Interior Justice, all have NASA for the spacecraft. All of them have some spectrum. And therefore, what happens is whenever an issue implicates federal spectrum, those guys all sit down and discuss it to make sure that they have a coordinated response on spectrum policy. The relevance for us as FCC students this Maymester is that when the FCC makes a decision that implicates federal spectrum holders, it has to be coordinated with the IRAC. So we're doing a new rulemaking on AWS-3. There are federal incumbents in the band. The FCC, the three amigos, draft their order. It goes through the exact process we just talked about. And then when Bill gets it in the chairman's office, or generally, it might happen when it goes to the bureau chief, it would get sent over to NTIA for a 3-week period of time for them to review the item and say it's okay or not okay. And that's the group that's going to look at it. So when it's an issue of joint jurisdiction, where it implicates federal as well as commercial, then the FCC has to send it to the IRAC to coordinate it. Okay? Any questions on that? Okay. So the CISMAC, Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee. Dale and I were the co-chairs of the CISMAC. It's a federal advisory committee for 4 years. What's cavorting down there, Joe?
Yeah.
So excited.
Yeah, I was just cheering.
It happens a lot. And we were co-chairs for 4 painful years. And now we continue to serve on it. And there's maybe 17 of us. We'll talk about it in one of our classes later in the course. But it's a federal advisory committee that advises NTIA on spectrum policy. FirstNet, which we know about, Bill will be working there later this summer, is also housed at NTIA. And then NIST, which we'll talk about in a second. And actually, Dale, why don't you talk about what NIST does, because I invariably botch this up.
NIST rather than ITS?
We went through this last year, too. Can you do NIST first and then do ITS?
Yeah, the lab down here, there's 2 facilities. There's the NIST Standards Lab, and that's where I still believe you have, I should know, the time and frequency information, the generator, the standard time and frequency stuff. And then they do an awful lot of other standards-related research. In other words, you go and talk to them, their stuff is all standards-related. And I mentioned ITS, Institute for Telecommunication Sciences. That used to be the old Central Radio Propagation Lab, and they do more scientific sort of studies like a propagation. So they're not just standards oriented. They do other things. But there is proposals now under Larry to create this center here, which would they can't legally merge them, but they would be coordinated more center, CAC or something, put them together. I didn't do that very well, but it gives you at least should give you a gist of. ITS is a really great place to work too if you're here in Boulder, because they do an awful lot of radio propagation studies and systems engineering studies and so forth. So internship, you know, you ought to think about
Ricky,
it.
can you make a note that we add ITS to this slide? So I don't. Thank you. Okay, so we just talked about the IRAC. 40% of government spectrum use is DoD, and then the rest of these agencies make up the rest of it. Federal government use in general is very prominent throughout the bands, and we'll talk about how much spectrum they control another time or in the next class. Okay, so that's NTIA. Any questions about the role of NTIA?
Trick question for the exam: who issues a radio license to the or an authorization to the FCC field offices for use in their trucks? Trick question.
NTIA.
Yeah, it's sort of an irony.
As a federal government agency, all federal government agencies have to get their spectrum through NTIA.
Yeah.
So only commercial can get it through the FCC,
Yeah.
or state and local public safety, which
So
is the other twist around.
That's a trick question.
Okay, which will now not be on the exam because it's way too easy. Okay, so that's NTIA. Now Ag. RUS, the Rural Utility Service, John Padalino is the administrator. This job was recently downgraded. It used to be a Senate confirmed job where the president appoints and is confirmed by the Senate, but it was downgraded so that it's just an appointed position that doesn't have to be confirmed by the Senate. The Rural Utility Service historically played a huge role in the electrification of the United States. That is just when we were connecting all homes to the electrical grid. Over time, it has evolved to include water, electric, and now telecom as well. But they had the stimulus money. They have distance learning and telemedicine there. They do some rural public television stuff. But rural development is their mandate. It's actually also a place where you can intern if to the extent you're interested. State Department, Danny Sepulveda, who worked for Senator Kerry on the Hill and then followed him over to the State Department. He's the lead on this U.S. Coordinator for International Communications and Information Policy. That is also a Senate-confirmed position, by the way. Handles international spectrum issues in consultation with NTIA and the FCC. We talked about that earlier. And represents the U.S. in international bodies like the ITU. Okay? External, merger authority. So if you are a telecommunications company, you kind of get a raw deal for the following reason. When you do a transaction, you've got to go through two people, not just one. So if you're a cereal company and you're trying to buy another cereal company, you go through the Justice Department, you get approval, you're done. Or you go through the FTC. In the telecom area, you've got to go through not just the FCC, not just the FTC or DOJ, but also the FCC, and they each have different standards. So FTC DOJ is an antitrust review, market power concentration, as you'll see here. Then the FCC has a broader public interest mandate, which basically says, is this or is this not consistent with the public interest? And they have a lot more discretion, which is why we end up with the piñata game, okay? Because they don't have to have the same legal standard as the others do. Let's see if I can get this, explain this in the right way. The Federal Trade Commission has limited jurisdiction, just like other independent agencies. And when Congress decided what their jurisdiction was, they carved out areas where other independent agencies already had authority. So, for example, postal issues, railroad issues, and indeed common carriers were carved out from the FTC's authority. For those of you soon to be at the Federal Trade Commission, almost all the commissioners of the Federal Trade Commission have called for the elimination of the common carrier exception, but thus far that has not passed Congress. So at the moment, if you're a common carrier, you cannot be subject to the FTC's jurisdiction, and therefore when you're doing two common carrier mergers, that is to say like a wireless licensee or a wireline licensee, you cannot be subject to Federal Trade Commission review for your merger. You have to go to DOJ, which is why, for example, the AT&T T-Mobile merger was done at DOJ, because the FTC couldn't do it because they are common carriers. Okay? In contrast, if you're a cable company, which is not a common carrier, you can be reviewed by the Federal Trade Commission. And there is a very complicated dance between the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission over who gets what deal. At one point, there were rumors that the heads of the two agencies played tennis, and whoever won the transactions. There have been various efforts to clarify who gets what, which has never really worked. They try to do guidelines and consistent with what we talked about before. So they try to do guidelines to divide up the industries and decide who got what kind of transactions. And Senator Hollings, who is then chair of the Senate Commerce Committee, says, whoa, you're not allowed to do that. I'm not letting things move from the Federal Trade Commission that I have jurisdiction over and give it to the Justice Department where the Judiciary Committee has jurisdiction. So I'm not going to give away that. So you can't do that over the executive branch. You can't decide which kind of deals go which place. That's up to us in Congress to decide, so you can't decide that. So anyway, the bottom line is, if you get a deal, you've got to go to both. So, for example, I'm working on Frontier has made a $2 billion bid to buy AT&T's wireline service in Connecticut. So I'm working on the transaction on behalf of Frontier. Within, I think it's 6 weeks of announcing the deal, DOJ signed off on it. It's going to take me 6 months to get through the FCC, and it's going to be a totally different kind of review. But for DOJ, there's no antitrust issues because, if anything, AT&T is becoming smaller and Frontier is a relatively small company. So they have no problem with it. But I'm still sitting around waiting for 6 months for the FCC to say what their concerns are and make a decision, despite the fact I only had one party file comments on it. But that's a whole separate problem. We'll talk about that in a second. And that was the unions who were just worried about keeping some jobs in Connecticut, which will make it happen. But anyway, go ahead.
How does the FCC define public interest?
Oh, they don't. That's why you get the piñata. Now, that's slightly too flip, but it's
not
pretty
much.
much true.
Yep, yeah.
It's not it is the most malleable. There are long law review articles written about what the public interest should or could mean and whether or not the public interest standard should be removed from the statute. So this is not, your question is very much consistent with the nature of the debates that are happening right now. Okay, questions about this? Okay, so AT&T T-Mobile, second and fourth largest wireless carriers at the time. So what happens when somebody wants to block a deal? So DOJ or FTC, if they think a deal is a problem, they go to court. They file a complaint against the deal and say, hey, this violates antitrust laws. So a court decides whether or not they've made their case or not. Very strict standards, sort of a proven process. In contrast, the FCC, if they're going to reject one, designates it for hearing, which means that it goes, remember on Monday we talked about the administrative law judge, how there used to be a whole bunch of them and now there's only one. So when Chairman Janikowski decided he's rejecting AT&T T-Mobile, Judge Sipple did a happy dance because he didn't have anything to do. So that case was going to go to Judge Sipple to have a full evidentiary hearing. Then what happens after the hearing's over? The judge makes a decision, then where does that go? Where? After the ALJ, where does it go? Nope.
No, back to the commission.
After ALJ, to the commission, right? Remember we were talking about our comparative hearings for broadcasters before? We said it goes from the ALJ to the commission, and then the commission decides whether or not the ALJ did the right thing, and then it would go to Court of Appeals. Many have argued, including me in a law review article at one point, that that really isn't review, because the bottom line is if I decide I'm designating something for hearing, I can drag that thing out for 1.5 years, and you effectively never could get your deal done. And so it is very, very hard to overcome a designation for hearing, and to the best of my knowledge, it's never actually happened. So DirecTV EchoStar was designated for hearing, they withdrew. AT&T T-Mobile was designated for hearing, they withdrew. People basically just give up because they're not prepared to fight on two fronts. They've got to do a DOJ lawsuit, and then they've also got to proceed in front of Judge Sipple. So effectively, you can send them into Never Never Land. We're going to talk later about Sprint and T-Mobile, because despite very clear signals from FCC and DOJ that they don't want those guys to announce a merger, SoftBank, the leadership of Sprint, has basically said he's still going to try and move forward in July. And so the real question is, how do they handle it, and what do they do? So it's going to be very interesting, especially if they actually go ahead and announce it. So a more simplistic example of a merger is Level 3 Global Crossing. You see that took, how many months is that? September's 9. So that's a 4-month deal, and everything moved forward, no conditions, done and done. So that was a very relatively clean process. Verizon Wireless Spectrum Co. T-Mobile. This one was hot and heavy 2 years ago when I taught the class. We worked on this deal on behalf of Verizon Wireless. DOJ approval came with a bunch of conditions because there was a bunch of, so Spectrum Co., was a wireless was the wireless venture of the cable companies. Comcast and other cable companies launched, or were thinking of launching their own wireless service. They ended up thinking it wasn't economic, so they ended up selling it all to Verizon Wireless. And so DOJ put a bunch of conditions on the deal. And then there was a lot of pressure that T-Mobile didn't like this deal because they wanted some of the spectrum. So lo and behold, T-Mobile suddenly had a transaction with Verizon Wireless to get some of the spectrum as part of this deal as well. So it all got rolled up into one big deal that was approved on August 21st, 2012. It had build-out requirements that were distinct to this transaction. So we talked earlier about when rules should apply only to certain parties. One might say that everyone who bought spectrum in a certain auction should have to build out on the same schedule. But as it turns out, if you buy them on a secondary market later and your name happens to be Verizon, you have to build them out quicker than everyone else because you happen to have a deal in front of them. Data roaming requirements and other reporting requirements as well. Okay? Sprint Clearwire. This is when SoftBank, the Japanese company, bought Sprint and Clearwire. You see the cycle there. And you see the process and the timing of the various agreements. We could go into more detail on that, but we don't need to for today. Anyway, mergers are really fun to look at and provide interesting context. State PUCs regulate intrastate communication and many others. Consumer protection. There's the Colorado PUC. Cooperative federalism. Basically, the states do have a role when they're supposed to work with the FCC. They also have state universal service funds that subsidize service in some states. Under the Section 332 of the Communications Act, states cannot regulate wireless rates, but can regulate other terms and conditions. And there's a lot of case law, a lot of argument around what those different words mean. So the dividing line has been subject to a lot of debate. So for example, if you have your Verizon phone and you sign a 2-year contract, and Cures tried to walk away from his contract after a year and a half, and he has to pay an early termination fee of $150. If a state wants to regulate that early termination fee, are they allowed to? So is that a rate, because it's $150 as an early termination fee the Cure has to pay? Or is it other terms and conditions because it's a penalty for him terminating the contract early? That's an example of the type of issues that they have at this level. They also have general law enforcement and consumer protection. You see attorney generals doing things all the time that implicate this. Just to go back to my Frontier AT&T transaction, so the Connecticut telephone company used to be called Southern New England Telephone, SNET, and AT&T bought them. When they bought them, SNET had long-distance licenses in 31 different states to do for Connecticut companies that were operating in Colorado, Nevada, et cetera, et cetera. So every time they had a company where they had customers, they would get a state certificate. So when Frontier went to buy SNET, the former SNET property from AT&T, we also needed to pick up and transfer the 31 state licenses that were controlled by the company. So we're in the process now of filing in 31 different states to get those little customer certifications transferred. In some cases, it's for 25 customers. But we still have to do it because you can't provide service in a state unless you're authorized. So even in many cases, states are just, file a notice and you're fine. In other states, you have to put a public interest showing, et cetera, but the states also have to sign off. External influences, international bodies, the ITU, standardization, allocation, radio spectrum, interconnection arrangements. We're going to have a whole international lecture later in the class, so I don't need to spend a lot of time here. ICANN debate's super interesting, and then the organization OECD does a lot of the rankings. You probably see that stuff out there. Consumers' participation. Obviously, as we talked about, anyone can file comments in FCC proceedings. Consumer groups also speak. Think tanks do a bunch of stuff. If you're looking for paper topics, if you poke around some of these think tank pages, all of them have extensive opinion-driven papers on various topics. Some of them more intellectually robust than others. But nonetheless, if you're looking for something controversial, almost all of those groups have a multitude of papers on their web pages that you could use as a foundation for a paper. Industry, so we have all the trade associations out there, all of them very active in the policy-making process. They often fight with each other. The incentive auction is a good example of NAB fighting against Consumer Electronics Association and CTIA, the Wireless Association. Rural versus larger urban carriers, cable versus the consumer electronics folks, all kinds of different examples of people who do different kinds of advocacy. Okay? I think I'm missing something on that. And then there's the press. So we talked about the Wesley Clark example, but there's lots of examples of how the press ends up driving the commission's agenda. I would argue that a lot of the snakes on a planes debate is a result of the way the press covered that in the first few days. Similarly, I think the open internet docket is a good example of the power of the press to shift the debate and change the way people are talking about something. So the press is definitely can be a very powerful influence. This is an example. This appeared in the New York Times, I think now 2.5 weeks ago, related to the net neutrality open internet debate. I think it's safe to say it is not the most flattering characterization. I also don't think it's fair, actually, to the chairman. But it is an example of the power of the press to sink in certain perceptions of what's going on in the agency. And I can assure you that all of the constituency groups that we've talked about to date today all saw this. Some of them might have even tried to get it placed. And it's just an example of the power of the press. Okay. Any other? Oh, and then you were going to bring up you circulated it, right? The Expanding Opportunities for Broadcasters Coalition thing? Yeah, it just went around. So Preston Patton, who some of you may know, has been affiliated with the law school and is the former head of the Disney Washington office, formed a coalition called the Expanding Opportunities for Broadcasters Coalition. He lives here in Boulder. His son works at Cable Labs. He and his son and I all had dinner on Monday. We came up with the idea that he should do a protest at the FCC to call attention to his argument, and so the Expanding Opportunities for Broadcaster Coalition press story that we sent around is a result of that. Because there was all this open internet stuff with the people camping out front, we thought it would be a good idea to have some counter pressure on the other side of a different issue. So that's how he's there. But it's another example of, and Preston's very good at knowing how to work the press, so that's what that's all about. And that's why we sent it around, because it's a very live example. Public trust safeguards, we'll go there next. Any questions about external influences? I'm going to do that. I'm going to do this in 10 minutes, and we're going to push off reform. Okay, so one of the important things about government service is that you need to maintain your objectivity and not become under the sway of outside influences, right? This is something that is true globally. And Dale talked earlier about when people decide to invest in various countries, one of the things that they really want to have confidence in is that you're going to get a decision, a transparent decision on the merits, that you're not going to be subject to unfair influences or people paying bribes or whatever. So there's a bunch of rules in the U.S. about how to limit it. So, for example, if you worked at the FCC and I'm an outside, I am who I am. I'm an outside lawyer. I can take you to lunch, but I can't spend more than $20 on you at lunch, so it's a cheap lunch, and I can only take you twice a year. Okay? Now, that seemingly is ridiculous, but it is absolutely the way it works. Similarly, you're not allowed to give them money. That seems like a pretty solid one. And there are limits on travel. So if you accept travel from you're not allowed to accept certain types of travel, and then in other cases, you just have to report it. So there are limitations on this. I feel like the lunch thing is particularly kind of goofy. I understand that we shouldn't be giving people money. I agree with that. And you probably shouldn't be taking them on vacation trips to Ireland to play golf, which is what got all the attention. What's that guy's name that went to prison?
Oh.
You know, the guy who took them all on golf trips.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. From Texas?
Yeah, Abramoff, Jack Abramoff.
Yeah.
So that, I get that. Now, whether or not $20 or $25 for lunch is going to sway someone's opinion, I have trouble with that. I think, as Dale and I have both said, if people have the right ethics, then this is not a problem. If they have the wrong ethics, I'm not sure that this is going to save them from it. Financial restrictions. Everybody has to report. Dale and I actually have to, as a result of our service on SISMAC as well. But federal government employees have to report their financial status and where their money comes from, et cetera, in annual reporting requirements. You'll often see Senator Stevens that we talked about earlier from Alaska, the guy who limited our phone support to one line instead of two. He ultimately got in trouble because he accepted home renovations from a contractor and didn't report it. It wasn't actually the accepting, it was the reporting that got him in trouble. So that's financial disclosure part. You cannot, for obvious reasons, if you work at the FCC, you cannot hold a bunch of stock in Google and then rule on things relevant to Google. Similarly, if your spouse works at Google, you're not allowed to have a job at the FCC and address things related to Google. So there's limitations like that. Similarly, employment restrictions. So I cannot go and join the FCC tomorrow and then rule on the Comcast Time Warner merger, right? There's a lot of reasons you wouldn't think that's right because I'm working on it. My firm has an interest. That's not allowed. Similarly, if I just left Verizon, I'm not allowed to go to the FCC and work on a Verizon matter. Also, if Ethan is working at the FCC and working on something related to, I'll go back to the deal, Comcast Time Warner, Ethan cannot then approach Comcast Time Warner and say, wouldn't you like to hire me? Because that's an obvious conflict of interest because he's working on their matter. So you cannot do that. If Ethan wants to get a job at Comcast Time Warner and wants to apply for it, he needs to withdraw from the work that he's working on for Comcast Time Warner, and then he can go apply. But he has to tell everyone he's doing that and then go do it. But you can't work on it and solicit employment at the same time. This is moderately important. I shouldn't say that. This is very important even in your internships. So depending on what you're working on, what you're doing, you need to be a little sensitive about asking for things from people where you're working on something. It's not the same. It's not like you're a full-time employee, but just be sensitive to it. And if you have questions about it, ask your supervisor if it's okay.
Absolutely.
Because you just don't want to get yourself whipsawed where you're in a weird spot. And you're either, even if it's like I'm a first year and I want to work somewhere a second year, and you're working on something related to the deal, and then you ask Comcast, it can be very awkward. So just try and play that the right way. And if you have questions about it, Dale or I or Vicki or Laura, anybody else can help you navigate that. But we don't want anything bad to happen as a result of this. Okay, so similarly, if you worked on a matter at the FCC and then you leave, you can't come back and lobby that exact same matter because the theory is you'd have or inappropriate influence. We talked about political employees versus non-political. And then President Obama has created this Obama pledge, which applies to certain employees but not others. I find it a little I'm not sure. I find it very arbitrary in terms of how it works because it doesn't seem to follow any intuitively logical subclass of employees. It seems to be both over and under inclusive. But the theory was to try and prevent the revolving door stuff from happening as much as it does, or as much as it perceives as happening. Confidentiality. This is also very important for all of you who are going to have jobs in the summer. You shouldn't discuss the internal commission documents. And similarly, if you're working at a company, you shouldn't discuss those either, right? You're going to have access to highly sensitive information. You do not want an intern or a temporary employee running around talking to people about what's in those documents. So it's always good to be super sensitive about that as well. It doesn't mean you can't describe in general terms what you're doing. You don't have to have that level of paranoia, but you just have to be sensitive about what you're talking about.
Could I add one thing? There's an awful temptation to talk to me or to Brian. It's just because you say, I learned this class, and now I'm working, look at what I'm doing in this. It's a natural sort of thing to want to tell us stuff, but be careful. It's just, it's so easy. And, I don't want you telling me.
But to be clear, you can say, I'm working on the merger. You just can't say, we're thinking about limiting their ownership to 4%.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that you can't do. But you can say, I'm working on the deal. Or you can say, I'm working on innovations in spectrum agile technology. That's fine. But just don't tell me what not that I know what it is anyway, but the code is that you're using to do that, right? Yeah. So it's the boundary between those two things that we just want you to be sensitive to. And then you can kind of go to jail if you release stuff that you're not supposed to. So I'm just trying to throw that out there. Just want to get that in before we finish. So the way this could manifest itself, and has sadly on one or two occasions, is someone who's not very bright decides they get their hands on a confidential commission document like a merger approval, and they decide to email it or fax it to a reporter. Don't do that. So that those are market moving things, right? Somebody buys stock a certain day, sells it the next day. That's insider trading. That has all kinds of bad things associated with it. Do not do it. And one presumes that you all know that, but I nonetheless want to make it clear that is a very bad thing to do. Yes. It also can happen by accident. So it also just underscores just be very, very careful with what you send via email, or faxing is a different story. But if what you send via email, because it is sometimes easy to move too fast, and instead your two-line automatically populates, and you meant to send it to someone inside the building, and it went to someone outside the building. Like, bad things can happen. Just be super, super careful when you're doing that stuff. Well, this is not a confidential disclosure. It's just a really bad story. But a junior lawyer at a law firm was doing a briefing for a trade association executive committee meeting, and I don't know why they did this via PowerPoint, but they did a PowerPoint slide that talked about each of the commissioners and about what they were objective about and what they weren't, and that this person's not that bright, and this person just follows the chairman, and this person only cares about the politics in their home state. And the associate, instead of sending it to the people in the team, sent it to the commission, and it got automatically filed into a docket. Yeah, he got fired.
Yeah.
But the problem, I mean, you know, it could happen. Well, I like to think it couldn't, but it could happen to almost anyone. I actually blame the partner or whoever told them to prepare a slide deck that had that stupid stuff in it, because it's just stupid to ever write that down.
Oh, yeah.
But it was, yeah, that was.
I just received something, an internal doc from a very, 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 very large company that was talking about this Dale Hatfield guy. And it was the same thing. You know, the person must have been typing it and somehow entered my name, so I got a CC copy from internal. Fortunately, they didn't attack me too badly.
Nice. So I have in my law firm, Bill Mayer works in my law firm. Marcus Mayer works at the FCC. Same last spelling. Same spelling to last name. And I've absolutely said, now thankfully it's been like, can you meet for lunch? But like it does happen. So just it's good for everyone to be very sensitive about that. Yeah, that PowerPoint though is apocryphal. Great story. Okay, ex parte rules. We've actually already covered this. And I think there's an example here of an ex parte meeting that I did on behalf of EchoStar. And this is a pretty representative example. So this is the rule that covers ex partes. This is where it is in the Code of Federal Regulations. This is the company I was representing, EchoStar. I had a separate telephone call on April 1st with me, obviously, and Aaron McGrath, who was in Commissioner McDowell's office, Louis Peretz in Commissioner Clyburn's office, David Goldman in Rosenworcel's office, Courtney Reinhardt in Pye's office, and Kate in the chairman's office. Well, that's weird. Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. Rod Porter from IB, et cetera, et cetera. This is what I talked to them about. And actually, I'm waiting for a Court of Appeals decision on this docket, which hopefully we're going to win. But this is just an example. This is what I talked to all of them about. You can summarize multiple conversations in one letter. That's permissible. Oh, and the other thing is you have to do it within 48 hours of, well, it's somewhat different for different kinds of contacts, but you notice the letter is dated the 2nd. You need to do it within a certain amount of time. You can't have the conversation and then wait 2 weeks to file the ex parte notice, because you have to give the other parties a chance to respond. Okay? So that's a relative, and that gets filed in the docket so everyone can see it. Okay? Okay, I'm going to stop there with 7 minutes to go, or 37 minutes on the old standard. Any questions about the public trust safeguards? Anything? All right, shall we game? Oh, but my questions are over there. Okay, so today we're going back to the Wilkinson Barker Nauer branded merchandise. Today we have the gum. Oops. There you go. There's your gum. All right, let's see. Now I got to get buzzers. You have the buzzers. You are awesome. All right, so I had this a second ago. Where did I put it?
You have to agree it's better than the buzzing for the wrong, right?
Yeah, right. It is. No, that's positive reinforcement.
Hold on.
Tell your kids what they're doing right, not what they're telling wrong. Doing it wrong.
Maybe they'll listen more.
All right, Dale, I did this yesterday during your lecture. Now I find it.
Blah, blah, blah,
Yeah,
blah.
right.
I was very good about doing this yesterday during Dale's lecture to write up all the questions, and now I can't find it. Hold on one second. Drat. Yeah, I know exactly. If I brought enough gum, that would work. Here we go. All right, so. Oh, yeah, this is good. All right, so. All right, we'll go. Let's see. Okay, so what is Moore's Law? Michael.
Computers get faster every 2 years. I give you the full definition, but essentially every
Well, you're the computer science guy. You're supposed to give me the full definition.
Every 18 months, the same size of, like, same circuit area, you can double the size of transistors on it for the same unit cost.
All right, very good. All right, well, keeping the theme, Shannon's Law. Yep.
Capacity of the lake.
Relates what to what?
Yeah, you gotta keep going.
That's the maximum theoretical capacity of link or
Per
based on the available bandwidth. I mean, yeah.
per
Per hertz per
Dale.
Well, no, you're not there yet. Not there yet.
Well, it's not much of a hint, Dale.
Well, yeah.
What might you need a little more of right now? You need a little more.
Yeah, it involves the capacity depends upon two things. One is the what? Yeah. Band. Yeah.
The signal to noise ratio.
Yes. Okay. Now we're going.
Yeah, the signal to noise ratio and the bandwidth.
There you go.
Per unit of
Good.
time, right? I thought I was supposed to get per unit of
That's
time
good.
at the end.
What?
Per unit of time, am I not supposed to get that at the end? Did I get that wrong?
No.
No, I got it wrong. That's good.
But
I know. That, you can't validate me for that. Okay, that's wow, that is the ultimate invalidation, Nikki. We are not becoming that class. I want my buzzer back. I want to start buzzing people. Okay, spectrum can be shared along 3 vectors. Name them. Yes. Oops, sorry. Good. Good. I gotta be careful with the gum. All right, now I feel like, okay, so what's the relevance of the cat? Yes.
Einstein's law that the way waves travel is like with a cat at New York, with the other end, some in Chicago. So you pull the tail and the cat makes a sound, but only the cat's actually not doing it.
Except there's no cat. Exactly right. Good job. That was actually the best move. Sorry. The gum moves faster than I realized. That's the best cat answer I've ever had in all the years of teaching. That's very good.
Speed of light there.
Okay, now I feel like we should have a harder one. All right, Dale, you want to have one, or do you want me to try and come up with one here?
I didn't bring my notes today.
Oh, all right. This seems too easy.
I had a whole list.
Oh, okay. Well, let's see. There are 4 steps in a decoder. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
What are the 4 steps of the decoder? Yes. Quantize is 1.
Yeah.
Sampling is 2.
Yeah.
2 more.
Got 2 more.
Sample and quantize I got so far.
What's the first one?
Encoding is 3.
Very first one. Very first one.
Yes, filtering is correct. Good job. I've got to break the gum in half if you only got 2 of the 4. That was going to be very complicated. All right, so any questions about today? I will miss. Well, no, we're all going now for drinks at the Med. Yes, Michael.
Actually, just a quick question. So you mentioned that T-Mobile's parent company is going forward with the merger, even though there's like a really high probability it's going to get rejected.
Other way, Sprint's parent company, SoftBank, is going after the purchase T-Mobile. Yep.
Is there like a point in doing that? Like, is there a business reason to like go forward with that?
So this is actually super interesting. So if you can postpone packing for 1 second, I want to spend a moment on this because it is very, very interesting what it is. So one might ask, as Michael just did, why you would try to do a deal that you don't think is going to get through because people have sent signals. You might think that you can still do it, right? So they have presented a case that if the 2 companies were to combine, that they could offer broadband speeds that would rival cable speeds, cable broadband speeds, and be a real competitor to wireline and cable in the United States. And they have made the case that in Japan they have been a market disruptor, and they would do the same thing here if they were allowed to buy T-Mobile. And that invariably, because Verizon and AT&T are so big, that combining 3 and 4 would actually be good for the economy and good for the competitive nature of the United States, and that the United market probably can't support 4. So you could go and make that case, and you could say, even though I'm getting all these negative signals, I have a chance to get this done, and my business plan is so important that I'm going to try and get this done. So that's one theory. Another theory is, while I have T-Mobile on the string, they're not going to be as adept at being a competitor, and it's going to mobilize them for a while. And I may not get them, but I also it's going to be to my advantage in the marketplace to try and do this. And so I might try and do this for a while. So that's another possibility. The other thing is they might get part of it, and the part of it might be valuable enough that it's worth doing, even though they have to divest a big part of it, and someone else is going to get that. So it's hard to say what the calculus is, but they've been very, very aggressive. But I've also never seen any government agency I've never seen a stronger signal from the government in advance of a deal than we've seen in the context of this one. So it's been very, very interesting. Okay, any other questions? All right, we'll see you at the Med in 30 minutes. Thanks, everybody. And I'll see you there.